She stood in the empty plaza with 3 worthless kitchen items and 17 cents to her name. Yesterday, Clara Whitmore had been a wife, a homeowner, a woman with a future. Today she was nothing, just another piece of debris left behind by a dead man's secrets. The creditors had taken everything: her home, her furniture, her wedding dress still hanging in the closet. They'd even pried her mother's ring from her finger while she watched. But they didn't want the cracked pot. They laughed at the worn skillet. They tossed the wooden spoon at her feet like garbage. So Clara picked them up, walked out of the only life she'd ever known, and made a choice that would either save her or kill her. She chose to cook. If you want to know how a woman with nothing rebuilt everything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels tonight. The rain had stopped 3 days ago, but Clara Whitmore's boots still squished with every step. The leather so waterlogged it had begun to crack along the seams. She didn't know how many miles she'd walked since leaving Ridgeway. She'd stopped counting after the first night, when she'd huddled beneath a wagon bridge and listened to the water rush beneath her, wondering if it would be easier to just roll into the current and let it carry her away. She hadn't rolled. She'd gotten up at dawn and kept walking. Now, standing at the edge of a frontier town she didn't even know the name of, Clara pressed her palm against the worn fabric of her dress and felt the hard edges of her last 17 cents through the thin cotton pocket. The coins had been in her husband's coat, the one the creditors hadn't bothered to search because it smelled like sweat and failure. Thomas's coat. Thomas's hidden coins. Thomas's secrets that had destroyed everything she'd built. The main street stretched before her, muddy and rutted, lined with wooden buildings that leaned against each other like exhausted travelers. A general store. A saloon with its doors swinging open to release the sour smell of whiskey and unwashed men. A hotel with a sign that read, "Rooms available," in faded paint, though Clara knew she couldn't afford even a corner of the stable behind it. What she could afford, barely, was beans. The general store's bell chimed weakly as she pushed through the door, and the man behind the counter looked up with the kind of disinterest that came from seeing too many desperate faces pass through. His eyes moved over her, the mud-stained hem of her dress, the wild strands of dark hair escaping from what had once been a respectable bun, the hollow cheeks that hadn't seen a proper meal in nearly a week. "Help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he doubted it. "Dried beans," Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped raw from disuse and thirst. "However many I can get for 15 cents. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "That'll get you about half a pound, maybe less, depending on how I'm feeling." "I'll take it." He measured out the beans with the kind of precision that suggested he was indeed feeling less than generous, pouring them into a small cloth sack that Clara accepted with both hands. The weight of it felt like salvation. Like possibility. "Anything else?" he asked. Clara's fingers tightened around the sack. "Is there a public well nearby? Somewhere I could use a fire?" The shopkeeper's expression shifted from disinterest to something closer to curiosity. "There's a plaza 2 streets over. Stone well in the center, fire pit that travelers sometimes use. Ain't nobody gonna stop you from sitting there, long as you don't cause trouble." "I won't cause trouble." "Didn't think you would." He paused, studying her face in a way that made Clara want to look away. "You got people coming for you? Family waiting somewhere?" "No." The word came out flat, final. "No family. No one waiting." The shopkeeper nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Plaza's that way. Mind the mud. It's still soft from the rain." Clara thanked him with a nod she hoped conveyed more gratitude than her voice could manage, and stepped back out into the weak afternoon sunlight. The plaza was exactly as described, a square of packed earth surrounded by low buildings, with a stone well at its center and a blackened fire pit nearby. A few wooden benches lined the edges, occupied by old men playing cards and women carrying baskets of laundry. They all looked up as Clara entered, tracking her movement with the casual vigilance of people who'd learned to notice strangers. She ignored them. At the fire pit, she knelt and began gathering the remnants of previous fires, half-burned sticks, scraps of paper, dried leaves that had blown in from somewhere greener. Her hands moved automatically, arranging kindling the way her mother had taught her 20 years ago, back when Clara had been a girl who thought fire was magic and cooking was love made visible. The skillet came out first, pulled from the canvas bag she'd carried across her back for days. It was cast iron, heavy, seasoned with decades of use until its surface gleamed almost black. The handle had been wrapped in leather that had cracked and peeled, and there was a chip along one edge where Clara's mother had dropped it during a winter storm, cursing in a way that had made young Clara giggle behind her hands. The pot came next, a tin thing with a crack running down one side that Clara had sealed with flour paste and prayer. It would hold water, at least for a while, long enough to boil beans. And finally, the wooden spoon. Oak, worn smooth by generations of stirring, its bowl stained dark from countless soups and stews and sauces. Her mother's spoon, her grandmother's spoon, the only thing Clara owned that still connected her to a time when she'd been happy. She'd fought for that spoon. When the creditors had come, 3 men in expensive suits with documents covered in numbers that made no sense. Numbers that said Thomas had borrowed against everything they owned. Numbers that said Clara's future belonged to strangers. She had stood quietly as they inventoried her life. She hadn't cried when they'd taken the furniture. She hadn't screamed when they'd carried out her mother's china, piece by piece. She'd even managed to stay silent when they'd pried the ring from her finger, the thin gold band Thomas had placed there 7 years ago, with promises he'd already known he wouldn't keep. But when one of them had reached for the kitchen drawer where the wooden spoon lay beside the cracked pot and dented skillet, something in Clara had broken. "Those are mine," she'd said. The creditor had laughed. "Ma'am, according to this document, everything in this house is collateral for—" "I brought those into this marriage. They belong to my mother. They have no resale value, no worth to anyone but me. You can take my home. You can take my dignity. But you will not take my mother's spoon." She'd stared at him with eyes that had nothing left to lose. And perhaps that was what convinced him. Perhaps he saw in her face the dangerous emptiness of a woman who had reached her limit and found she could go further still. Whatever the reason, he'd set down the spoon, held up his hands in mock surrender, and laughed again. "Fine. Keep your kitchen junk. It won't feed you anyway." But he was wrong. Clara struck the flint and steel she'd found abandoned beside the road 2 days ago, sending sparks into the kindling until it caught and bloomed. She fed the young fire carefully, nurturing it the way she'd once hoped to nurture children, the way she'd thought she would spend her life nurturing a home and a husband who loved her. Thomas had not loved her. She understood that now. He'd needed her respectability, her small inheritance, her blind faith in a man who smiled easily and lied even more easily. He'd married her for her money and her trust, and he'd spent both without hesitation. The debts had been accumulating for years, hidden behind Thomas's confident assurances that everything was fine, that business was good, that their future was secure. Their future had died with him when his horse threw him 3 weeks ago. The creditors had arrived before his body was cold. The fire crackled and grew, and Clara filled the cracked pot with water from the well. She set it over the flames, balanced carefully on 3 stones she'd arranged in a triangle, and poured in the beans. 1/2 pound. Maybe less. Around her, the plaza continued its afternoon rhythm. Children ran past, chasing a dog that was chasing its own tail. The old men argued over their cards in voices weathered by tobacco and time. A woman carrying a basket of eggs stopped to watch Clara's fire for a moment, then shook her head and moved on. Clara didn't care if they watched. She'd spent too many years caring what people thought, playing the proper wife, maintaining appearances, pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine at all. Now she had nothing left to protect, no reputation to guard, no future to preserve for a husband who no longer existed. All she had was beans, water, fire, and 3 kitchen items the creditors had deemed worthless. She was going to cook a meal. The beans took time. Good beans always did. You couldn't rush them without sacrificing flavor, without ending up with hard centers and watery broth. Clara knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat. Cooking was the one thing that had always belonged to her, the one skill Thomas couldn't spend or gamble or borrow against. As the water began to simmer and the beans began to soften, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the last 2 cents she hadn't spent. 2 cents wouldn't buy anything. 2 cents was an insult, a joke, a reminder of how far she'd fallen. But as she turned the coins over in her palm, she remembered something her mother had told her during the hard winter when Clara was 12, when the crops had failed and the livestock had sickened, and their family had survived on stubbornness and prayer. Food isn't just nourishment, her mother had said, stirring a pot of soup made from bones and scraps and things they'd gathered from the frozen fields. Food is dignity. When you cook for someone, when you take nothing and make it into something that warms their belly and their heart, you're telling them they matter. You're telling yourself you matter. A woman who can cook will never be truly worthless, Clara. Remember that. Clara remembered. She used the 2 cents to buy a tiny bundle of wild sage from an old woman selling herbs at the edge of the plaza. The woman had looked at the coins, looked at Clara's face, and added a sprig of rosemary to the bundle without being asked. "You're going to need more than that to survive, honey," the woman had said. "I know," Clara had replied, "but I'm going to start with this." Back at the fire, she crushed the sage between her palms and let it fall into the simmering beans. The smell rose immediately, earthy, warm, alive. It mixed with the smoke from the fire and the dust from the plaza and became something new, something that made the old men at the card table pause mid-argument and turn their heads. Clara stirred with her mother's spoon, tasting as she went, adjusting the position of the pot to control the heat. The beans were softening now, releasing their starch into the water, creating a thickening broth that would coat the tongue and satisfy the stomach. She'd made the same dish 100 times in her own kitchen, but it had never tasted like this. It had never meant this much. "That smells like heaven." Clara looked up to find an elderly man standing at the edge of the fire pit, leaning on a walking stick that had been carved with symbols she didn't recognize. His face was weathered brown, lined with decades of sun and wind, and his eyes held the sharp clarity of someone who had learned to see more than most people showed. "It's just beans," Clara said. "Nothing is just anything." The man gestured toward the pot with his stick. "May I?" Clara hesitated. She had nothing. These beans were all that stood between her and true starvation. But something in the old man's face reminded her of her mother's words about dignity, about the act of feeding being as sacred as the act of eating. She nodded. The old man produced a dented tin cup from somewhere within his worn coat and held it out. Clara ladled in a portion of beans, watching the steam rise between them like a prayer made visible. The man tasted. His eyes closed. When they opened again, there was something new in their depths, recognition, perhaps, or respect. "Who taught you to cook?" he asked. "My mother." "She taught you well. This is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "This is made with care. I can taste it. The sage was a good choice. It speaks of the land, of roots, of things that endure." Clara felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been holding closed since Thomas's death, since before his death, if she was honest, since the first time she'd realized her husband's charm was just a mask over emptiness. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. The old man studied her face with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You've lost much recently. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, like you're still bracing for the next blow." "I've lost everything." "No." He shook his head slowly. "You have a fire, a pot, a spoon, and skill. That's more than nothing. That's the beginning of something, if you choose to make it so." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The beginning of what? I'm a widow with no home, no family, no prospects. I'm cooking beans in a public plaza because I have nowhere else to go." "And yet you're cooking." The old man set down his empty cup and leaned closer, his voice dropping to something that felt almost conspiratorial. "There's a ranch in the mountains, 2 days' walk northwest of here, the Hartman place. You'll know you're getting close when the trees start to thin and the air gets sharp enough to taste. The owner is a hard man. Harsh, they say. Silent. He lost his wife in a fire some years back and hasn't been the same since." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the Hartman Ranch has been without a proper cook for 6 months. The men eat hardtack and burned meat and complain with every bite. They'd pay well for someone who could make beans taste like this." Clara shook her head. "I don't know anything about ranching. I was a town wife. I've never even been on a horse." "You don't need to know about horses. You need to know about food, about turning simple ingredients into something that nourishes the body and the spirit. The old man smiled, revealing teeth worn down by years. The rest you'll learn, if you're willing to learn. How do you know about this ranch? About the man who owns it? The old man's smile deepened. I've traveled these lands longer than you've been alive, child. I know most of what happens in these mountains. I know Caleb Hartman lost his heart the night his wife burned, and I know his men are slowly losing their loyalty because a man who won't eat can't lead, and a ranch that won't feed its workers won't survive. And you think I can change that? A stranger with a cracked pot and nothing to my name? I think you can cook. The old man pushed himself upright, adjusting his grip on the walking stick. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's everything. He began to turn away, then paused. 2 days northwest. Follow the river until it forks, then take the left branch uphill. The ranch sits in a valley where the winds die down. You'll smell the cattle before you see them. Wait, Clara called. What's your name? The old man looked back over his shoulder. Names are just sounds people use to call each other. What matters is what you do with the time between being called. And then he was gone, limping across the plaza and disappearing into the maze of streets beyond, leaving Clara alone with a fire that was starting to burn low, and a pot of beans that had somehow become a choice. She spent the night in the plaza, curled beneath a wooden bench with her canvas bag as a pillow and her mother's spoon clutched to her chest like a talisman. The stars wheeled overhead, bright as scattered diamonds against the velvet black, and Clara watched them until her eyes grew heavy and sleep pulled her under like a gentle tide. She dreamed of Thomas. In the dream, he was alive again, standing in the doorway of the home they'd shared, wearing that charming smile that had once made her heart race. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. She could see that now, see what she'd been blind to for 7 years. Behind the smile was hunger, cold and calculating, the hunger of a man who saw other people as resources to be exploited. You're worthless without me, Dream Thomas said. You know that, don't you? Nobody wants a widow with empty pockets and dirt on her dress. Nobody will ever want you. Clara woke with the words ringing in her ears and the first gray light of dawn spreading across the plaza. Her back ached from the hard ground. Her stomach cramped from too little food over too many days. And Thomas's voice still echoed in her skull, telling her she was nothing, that she would always be nothing, that the best she could hope for was a quick death in some forgotten corner of the frontier. But her mother's voice was there too, softer but persistent, reminding her that a woman who could cook would never be truly worthless. Clara sat up, brushed the dust from her dress, and made her decision. She would go to the Hartman ranch. Maybe the old man had been lying or confused. Maybe she would walk for 2 days and find nothing but wilderness and her own exhaustion. Maybe Caleb Hartman would take one look at her and turn her away. But at least she would have tried. At least she would have chosen something other than surrender. She ate the last of the beans for breakfast, scraping the pot clean with her wooden spoon and savoring every bite. Then she packed her 3 kitchen items into the canvas bag, slung it across her back, and began to walk. The journey was harder than she'd expected. The old man had made it sound simple. Follow the river, take the left fork, smell the cattle. He hadn't mentioned the steep inclines that left Clara gasping for breath, or the rocky paths that twisted her ankles, or the cold that crept into her bones as the elevation climbed and the air thinned. By the end of the first day, Clara's feet were bleeding through her ruined boots. By the middle of the second day, she'd finished the last of the water she'd carried from the well and was scooping handfuls from the river, not caring anymore if it was clean. Her dress had torn in 3 places. Her hair had escaped its braid entirely and hung in wild tangles around her face. But she kept walking. The trees began to thin as the old man had promised, giving way to rocky meadows dotted with wildflowers and scraggly brush. The air did indeed grow sharp, carrying with it the bite of coming winter and the faint, unmistakable smell of cattle. Clara had never cared for that smell before, had always wrinkled her nose when she'd passed stockyards in town. But now it smelled like hope, like destination, like the end of a journey that had nearly killed her. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. It sat in a natural valley, protected from the mountain winds by a ridge of ancient rock, and it was larger than Clara had expected. A main house, weathered but solid, dominated the center. Behind it spread a collection of outbuildings, bunkhouses, she assumed, and storage sheds and a massive barn that even from a distance looked well maintained. Cattle dotted the surrounding fields, their lowing carrying faintly on the cooling air. Horses moved in a corral near the barn, and she could see figures, men, she assumed, ranch hands going about their evening work. Clara stopped at the edge of the valley and allowed herself one moment of doubt. What was she doing here? She was a widow from a small town, a woman whose only skill was cooking, whose only possessions were 3 kitchen items that creditors had deemed worthless. What made her think she could walk into this place and convince a stranger to give her a chance? Nothing, she realized. Nothing made her think that. But she had nowhere else to go, and her mother's voice was still whispering in the back of her mind, and the alternative was lying down in the mountain grass and waiting for the cold to take her. Clara adjusted the strap of her canvas bag, lifted her chin, and began the descent into the valley. The first person she encountered was a young man, maybe 20 or 21, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of easy smile that suggested he hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be. He was carrying a bucket of water toward the bunkhouse when he spotted Clara and stopped dead, his smile freezing into something closer to confusion. "Ma'am?" He set down the bucket and approached slowly, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. Are you lost?" "No," Clara said, though her voice came out as a croak. "I'm looking for Caleb Hartman." The young man's eyebrows shot up. "You're looking for the boss? Did he send for you?" "No, but I'm told he needs a cook." A strange expression crossed the young man's face, something between hope and skepticism. "Well, that's certainly true. We've been eating burned bacon and underdone biscuits for half a year now. Last cook quit after one of the boss's moods." He seemed to catch himself like he'd said too much. "I'm Henry, by the way. Henry Cole." "Clara Whitmore." Henry looked her over, taking in her torn dress, her ruined boots, her wild hair, the canvas bag slung across her back. Whatever he saw seemed to concern him. "Mrs. Whitmore, you look like you've walked through hell to get here." "Nearly," Clara admitted. 2 days from the town in the valley. I followed the river." 2 days? On foot?" Henry's eyes widened. "Lord, ma'am, you should sit down. Let me get you some water, some food." "What I need," Clara interrupted, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, "is to speak with Mr. Hartman. If he doesn't want me here, I'll leave. But I've walked too far to turn back without at least trying." Henry hesitated, clearly torn between his concern for her well-being and his reluctance to disturb his employer. Finally, he nodded. "The boss is in the main house, but I should warn you, he's not an easy man. He doesn't smile, doesn't small talk, doesn't suffer fools. If you're expecting kindness, you won't find it here." "I'm not expecting kindness," Clara said. "I'm expecting a chance. That's all I need." She walked past him toward the main house, feeling his eyes on her back, hearing the resumed slosh of water as he picked up his bucket and continued his interrupted journey. Other men had emerged from various buildings to watch her pass. She could feel their stares like heat against her skin, but she didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the front door of the main house, on the weathered wood and the iron handle, on the threshold she was about to cross. She climbed 3 steps to a wooden porch that wrapped around the front of the house, boards creaking beneath her damaged boots. The door loomed before her, solid and unwelcoming. Clara raised her fist and knocked. Silence. She knocked again. More silence, followed by footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who didn't hurry for anyone. The door swung open, and Clara found herself face to face with Caleb Hartman. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples, and his face might have been handsome once before grief and time had carved it into something harsh and unyielding. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention and held it, gray as storm clouds, cold as mountain stone, and utterly, completely empty. "Whatever you're selling," he said, "I'm not buying." "I'm not selling anything." Clara's voice didn't shake, though she wasn't sure how she managed that. I'm told you need a cook. Caleb's expression didn't change by even a fraction. Told by who? An old man in the town below. He said your ranch has been without a proper cook for 6 months, and your men are suffering for it. My men are fine. Are they? Clara met his empty eyes with her own, refusing to look away. Are you? Something flickered in those gray depths. Surprise, perhaps, that anyone would dare speak to him so directly. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold blankness that seemed to be his natural state. I don't know you, Caleb said. I don't need a cook. And I certainly don't need a woman who looks like she crawled out of a grave showing up on my doorstep with fairy tales about old men and their advice. Then I'll leave. Clara didn't move. But first, let me cook you one meal. If you don't like it, if it doesn't meet your standards, I'll walk back down that mountain and you'll never see me again. But if I can make you something worth eating, something that actually tastes like food instead of charcoal, then you let me stay. 1 week, that's all I'm asking. 1 week to prove myself. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could feel the exhaustion trembling through her limbs, could feel everything she had riding on this moment, on this man's decision. You walked 2 days to get here, he said finally, through the mountains, alone. Yes. Why? Clara considered lying, considered crafting some story that would make her sound less desperate than she was. But she'd had enough of lies. Thomas had been nothing but lies. And look where that had gotten her. Because I have nowhere else to go, she said simply. My husband died 3 weeks ago and left me with nothing but debt. The creditors took everything, my home, my possessions, my future. All I have left is a skillet, a pot, a wooden spoon, and the knowledge of how to use them. So I walked, and I kept walking until I found someone who might need what I can offer. Caleb's eyes dropped to the canvas bag on her shoulder, as if seeing it for the first time. His jaw tightened. The kitchen's through the back, he said, stepping aside. Show me what you can do, Chun. The kitchen was a mess. It had clearly once been well maintained. Clara could see the bones of good design in the large iron stove, the ample counter space, the hooks for pots and pans that now hung empty. But months of neglect had left their mark. Grease stained the walls near the stove. Dirty dishes filled the basin, a fine layer of dust-covered surfaces that should have gleamed. Clara set her canvas bag on the counter and surveyed the damage without comment. Whatever she felt about the state of this space, she knew better than to voice it. Criticism wouldn't earn her a place here. Only results would do that. What do you have? She asked Caleb, who had followed her in and now stood watching from the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. Pantry's through there. He jerked his chin toward a narrow door. Take what you need. Clara investigated and found the pantry in better shape than the kitchen. Someone had at least made an effort to keep the supplies organized. Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, rice, canned goods. A side of beef hanging in the cold room. Eggs in a wire basket. Potatoes beginning to sprout eyes in a dark corner. Not ideal, but workable. More than workable, actually. This was abundance compared to what she'd had in that plaza. She emerged from the pantry with her arms full and began to organize her workspace. First, she cleaned. It was important, she'd learned from her mother, to start with clean space. Dirt and grease had no place in proper cooking. They dulled flavors, spoiled food, told whoever ate the meal that they weren't worth better care. Caleb watched in silence as she scrubbed the counter, washed the dishes, wiped down the stove. His expression never changed, but Clara had the sense that she'd surprised him somehow, that he'd expected her to jump straight to cooking without regard for the foundation. Only when the kitchen gleamed did Clara turn to the actual meal. She worked quickly, her hands moving with the confidence of long practice. The beef went into her own skillet, the seasoned cast iron that had been her mother's, along with onions and garlic she'd found in the pantry. The smell rose immediately, rich and savory, filling the kitchen with a warmth that had clearly been lacking. While the meat browned, she mixed biscuit dough, her wooden spoon cutting through flour and buttermilk with practiced ease. She'd made these biscuits 1,000 times, could do it in her sleep, but she gave the task her full attention anyway. Every detail mattered. Every choice she made in this kitchen would be judged. Potatoes went into another pot, scrubbed clean and cut into chunks to boil for mashing. Green beans from a jar were transferred to a pan with butter and a pinch of the sage she'd saved from the old woman's bundle. The biscuits went into the oven, their surfaces brushed with the last of the buttermilk to ensure a golden crust. And through it all, Caleb watched. He never spoke, never moved from his position in the doorway, but Clara could feel his attention like a physical weight. She'd expected hostility, or at least impatience. What she got instead was something that felt almost like hunger, not for food, but for something he couldn't name, something he'd maybe forgotten existed. "It's almost ready," Clara said when the biscuits emerged golden and perfect, when the beef had developed a crust that made her mouth water, when the potatoes were mashed smooth with butter and salt, and a splash of the cream she'd found hidden in the cold room. "Do you want to eat here, or—" "Dining room." Caleb's voice was rougher than it had been before. "The men will want to see what you've made." Clara nodded and began transferring the food to serving dishes. Her hands were shaking slightly. Exhaustion, she told herself, not nerves, but she didn't let it show. She arranged everything on the dishes with care, paying attention to presentation, even though she suspected these men would care more about taste than appearance. But her mother had always said that a beautiful plate was the first act of love. The dining room table was long, designed to seat at least a dozen, though only 8 men were present when Clara entered with the first of the dishes. They'd clearly been summoned by Caleb or by the smell of cooking, probably both, and they sat with the resigned expressions of men expecting another disappointing meal. Clara set down the platter of beef, the bowl of mashed potatoes, the pan of green beans. She returned to the kitchen and emerged with the basket of biscuits, still warm from the oven, and a small crock of butter she'd found in the cold room. The men stared at the food. Then they stared at her. Then they stared at Caleb, who had taken his place at the head of the table with an expression that gave nothing away. "Well?" Caleb said. "Eat." There was a moment of hesitation, of suspicious glances exchanged, and then one of the older men, his face weathered and his hands scarred from decades of ranch work, reached for a biscuit. He tore it in half, watching steam escape from its fluffy interior, and took a bite. His eyes closed. His chewing slowed. When he opened his eyes again, there was something like reverence in them. "Good Lord," he breathed. "That's a real biscuit." The spell broke. Hands shot out, grabbing for food, piling plates high with portions that would have seemed greedy if not for the desperation behind them. Clara watched as grown men who probably hadn't complimented anything in years made sounds of appreciation between bites, as they reached for seconds before they'd finished firsts, as they looked at her with a mixture of amazement and gratitude that made her eyes sting. She'd done this. With nothing but a few ingredients and the skill her mother had taught her, she'd given these men something they'd been missing for 6 months, something as simple as a good meal. At the head of the table, Caleb ate in silence. He didn't make sounds of pleasure like his men. He didn't reach for seconds, but Clara watched him take a bite of the beef, then another, then a third. She watched him split a biscuit and spread it with butter that melted into the warm bread. She watched him clear his entire plate, methodically and thoroughly, not leaving a single bite behind. When the meal was over and the men began pushing back from the table, bellies full and faces more relaxed than they'd been in months, Caleb finally spoke. "1 week," he said, looking directly at Clara for the first time since the cooking had begun. "You get 1 week to prove you can do this consistently. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. You'll have the small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's private. You cook 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. Sunday is your rest day. Any questions?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say thank you, wanted to express the overwhelming gratitude flooding through her, but she knew instinctively that Caleb Hartman wouldn't want her thanks. He didn't deal in sentiment. He dealt in facts, in work, in the practical exchanges that kept a ranch running. "No questions," she said. I'll start on breakfast at dawn." Caleb nodded once, sharply, and stood from the table. He walked past her toward the door, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she'd been foolish enough to try. Close enough to see that his eyes, when they met hers for a fraction of a second, weren't quite as empty as she'd first believed. There was something buried there, something sealed away behind walls of silence and grief, something that had stirred just slightly at the taste of a meal made with care. Caleb Hartman disappeared into the darkening evening, and Clara Whitmore, Widow, wanderer, woman with nothing but 3 kitchen items to her name, began to clear the dishes from her first meal at the ranch. She didn't know what the next week would bring. She didn't know if she could really earn a permanent place here, if she could survive the harsh conditions and the harsher man who owned this land. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, Clara lay in the small room off the kitchen, barely more than a closet, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the dark fields, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses shifting in the corral, the creak of old wood as the house contracted in the cooling air. She thought about the old man in the plaza, with his carved walking stick and his knowing eyes. She thought about Thomas, cold in his grave, his lies finally buried with him. She thought about her mother, gone 10 years now but still present in every meal Clara cooked, every stir of the wooden spoon, every seasoning choice that came not from recipes but from instinct passed down through generations. She thought about Caleb Hartman, eating in silence, clearing his plate, his eyes betraying a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Whatever had broken this man, whatever fire had sealed him behind walls of grief and silence, Clara sensed it would take more than a week to reach. It might take longer than she had. It might never yield at all. But she was here now, and she had work to do, and for the first time since the creditors had walked through her door, Clara felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Tomorrow would bring breakfast, and after breakfast, lunch, and after lunch, dinner. One meal at a time, one day at a time, she would build something new from the ashes of her old life. She fell asleep with her mother's wooden spoon beside her pillow and the first stars of evening shining through her tiny window, painting patterns of light on the rough-hewn wall. The first week passed in a blur of flour and fire and the quiet rhythms of ranch life. Clara woke each morning before dawn, when the sky was still purple with the last traces of night and the air held that sharp mountain chill that made her breath visible in small white clouds. She would dress quickly in the dim light, pull her hair back into a practical braid, and make her way to the kitchen while the rest of the ranch still slept. Those early morning hours became sacred to her. The kitchen was hers alone then, silent except for the crackle of the fire she built in the stove and the soft sounds of her own movement. She would heat water for coffee, mix biscuit dough, crack eggs into her mother's skillet, and let the familiar motions settle her mind for the day ahead. The men came to depend on those breakfasts. Clara could see it in the way they arrived at the dining room table each morning with expressions that had shifted from skeptical hope to genuine anticipation. They no longer poked at their food with suspicion or braced themselves for disappointment. They sat down expecting something good, and Clara made sure she delivered. Henry, the young man who had first greeted her, became something like a friend during those early days. He was 19, she learned, the youngest of the ranch hands, sent west by parents who believed hard work would make a man of him. He had an easy laugh and a kind heart, and he'd taken to lingering in the kitchen doorway during meal preparations, chatting with Clara while she worked. "You know," he said one morning, watching her roll out pie crust with the practiced efficiency of long experience, "the boys have been talking about you." Clara didn't look up from her work. "Good things, I hope." "Very good things. Max said your pot roast last night was better than his own mother's, and Mac's mother was a legendary cook back in Tennessee. He nearly cried saying it." "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should. Mac doesn't give compliments." Henry leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "Even Tom's been saying nice things, and Tom complains about everything. Weather, work, women, you name it. Tom's got something negative to say about it. But yesterday he told me your coffee is the only thing that makes getting up worthwhile." Clara allowed herself a small smile. "Coffee's easy. You just have to not burn it. You'd be surprised how many people find that difficult." Henry paused, and his voice grew more serious. "The boss has been eating too, full plates every meal. I don't think you understand how unusual that is." Clara's hand stilled on the rolling pin. "He barely speaks to me. I wasn't sure he even noticed the food." "He notices. He notices everything." Henry glanced over his shoulder as if checking that they were truly alone. "Before you came, Mr. Hartman barely ate at all. A few bites here and there, just enough to stay standing. We were worried about him. All of us were. A man can't run a ranch on black coffee and stubbornness. What happened to him? Clara asked, though she already knew part of the answer. The old man who sent me here mentioned a fire, a wife who died. Henry's expression shifted, the easy smile fading into something more complex. It was 3 years ago. Mrs. Hartman, Sarah, her name was, she was everything to the boss. The heart of this place. She laughed like music, my dad used to say, made everyone around her feel like they mattered. Your father worked here? Still does. He's the foreman. You'll meet him properly once the cattle drive ends next week. But he was here that night, the night of the fire. He doesn't talk about it much. None of the men who were here do. Clara slid the pie crust into a dish and began crimping the edges. What happened? Henry was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Lightning strike. Dry summer, worst drought in 20 years, and a storm rolled through one August night. Lightning hit the barn. The old barn, not the one standing now, and it went up like kindling. Mrs. Hartman was in there. Clara's hand stopped moving. Why? A mare was foaling, first-time mother, having trouble. Sarah had a gift with animals, could calm any creature just by being near it. She'd gone out to help with the birth, and Henry swallowed hard. The boss was in town that night, picking up supplies. By the time he rode back, the barn was nothing but flames. He ran straight in after her. 3 men had to drag him out, and even then he kept fighting them, kept trying to go back. They had to knock him unconscious to keep him from burning alive alongside her. Clara pressed her palm flat against the cool surface of the counter, steadying herself. They didn't find her? They found her. What was left of her? Henry's voice cracked slightly. She'd gotten the mare out. The horse was standing in the paddock, healthy as anything, with a newborn foal beside her. Sarah must have gone back in for something. We never figured out what. By the time anyone realized she was still inside, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara thought about Caleb Hartman, about those gray eyes that seemed to hold nothing, about the walls of silence he'd built around himself. She thought about running into flames for someone you loved and being dragged away by force. She thought about waking up to find that love reduced to ashes and bones. He blamed himself, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. He blamed everyone. Himself most of all, but everyone. He fired half the hands in the first month, said they should have stopped her from going in, should have gotten to her faster, should have done something. The ones who stayed did it out of loyalty to what this ranch used to be back when Sarah was alive. Henry pushed himself off the doorframe and ran a hand through his sun-bleached hair. I probably shouldn't be telling you all this. The boss is a private man. He'd have my hide if he knew I was spreading his business around. I won't say anything. I know you won't. That's why I'm telling you. Henry met her eyes with an earnestness that seemed older than his 19 years. He's a good man, Mrs. Whitmore. Under all that silence and all that pain, he's the best man I know. He just forgot how to show it. Maybe you can help him remember. Before Clara could respond, Henry was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as he headed out to his morning work. She stood alone in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her mind full of fire and grief, and a gray-eyed man who had tried to walk into flames for love. The pie waited to be filled. Clara shook off her thoughts and returned to work, but something had shifted inside her, something that felt like understanding. The days continued to pass, each one building on the last like bricks in a wall Clara was constructing around her new life. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings when the men rode out to check fence lines and count cattle, the midday break when they returned sun-weathered and hungry, the quiet evenings when exhaustion settled over everyone like a blanket. She learned the preferences of individual men, too. Mac liked his eggs over easy, and his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Tom wanted extra butter on everything and would eat any vegetable except peas, which he claimed his mother had force-fed him as a child until he developed a permanent aversion. Henry had a sweet tooth and would hover near the kitchen whenever Clara baked, hoping for scraps of raw cookie dough or the first slice of fresh pie. And Caleb remained a mystery. He took his meals at the head of the table, always in the same chair, always in silence. He ate everything Clara put in front of him, cleaned his plate with a thoroughness that suggested appreciation, even if his face never showed it. But he rarely spoke, rarely looked at her for more than a glancing moment, rarely acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional nod when she refilled his coffee cup. It should have bothered her, that silence. In her old life, she'd been accustomed to conversation, to the social pleasantries that filled the spaces between people. Thomas had been charming, endlessly charming, always ready with a witty comment or a flattering observation. She'd mistaken that charm for connection, never realizing that the constant flow of words was just another way of hiding. Caleb's silence felt different. It wasn't hostile or dismissive. It was simply the way he was, the way he had perhaps always been, or the way he had become in the aftermath of loss. Clara found herself respecting it, even appreciating it. In a world full of empty words, there was something honest about a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. Still, she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. She watched the way he moved through his domain with the quiet authority of someone who had built this life with his own hands. She watched the way he handled the horses, gentle despite his size, patient despite his reputation. She watched the way his men looked at him, not with fear exactly, but with a cautious respect that spoke of deep loyalty beneath the surface wariness. He was a man worth knowing, she decided, a man worth the effort of understanding. Whether he wanted to be known or understood was another question entirely, but Clara had never been one to give up easily. The week ended on a Sunday, Clara's designated rest day, and she found herself at loose ends for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The men had scattered to their various pursuits, some to town, some to the bunkhouse for cards and sleep, some to the endless small tasks that kept a ranch running even on the Sabbath. Clara wandered the property with no particular destination in mind, simply wanting to see more of the place that had become her unexpected home. The main house was larger than she'd initially realized, with rooms that seemed to have been closed off and forgotten. She didn't explore them, that felt like trespassing, but she peered through dusty windows and wondered what they had looked like when Sarah Hartman was alive. Had there been laughter in those rooms? Parties, gatherings, the kind of warm hospitality that made a house into a home? Behind the house, she discovered a garden that had clearly been abandoned. Raised beds still held the skeletal remains of plants long dead, and a trellis that had once supported climbing roses now stood bare and weathered. A stone path wound through the space, leading to a wooden bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Clara sat on the bench and closed her eyes, letting the warmth soak into her skin. The mountain air smelled of sage and pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers beginning their late-season bloom. For a moment, she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, somewhere that didn't require her to be strong every minute of every day, somewhere she could simply exist without fighting for her right to do so. Sarah planted this garden. Clara's eyes flew open. Caleb stood at the edge of the overgrown beds, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable as always. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't sensed his presence until he spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to rise. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just exploring and I found this place and—" "Sit." The word was firm but not unkind. "It's your rest day. You can sit wherever you please." Clara lowered herself back onto the bench, uncertain what to do with this unexpected interaction. Caleb hadn't sought her out once in the entire week she'd been here. He'd barely acknowledged her beyond the basic courtesies of an employer to an employee. And now here he was, standing in his dead wife's abandoned garden, voluntarily speaking to her. "She loved this garden," he continued, his eyes moving over the tangled mess of dead vines and encroaching weeds. "Spent hours out here every day, even when the work piled up and I told her she was wasting time. She said plants were never a waste of time, said they taught you patience, showed you that good things take seasons to grow." Clara didn't speak. She sensed that Caleb was saying something he needed to say, something that had been building up behind his walls of silence, and she didn't want to interrupt whatever process was unfolding. "I should have torn it out after she died. Should have cleared the whole thing and used the space for something practical, but I couldn't." His voice roughened. "I couldn't be the one to destroy the last thing she touched." "It's still here," Clara said softly. "Under all the overgrowth, the bones of it are still here. The beds, the path, the trellis. It could be brought back to life, if someone took the time." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment those gray eyes weren't empty at all. They were full of something vast and terrible, a grief that hadn't diminished with time, but had simply been compressed, made denser, harder to carry with each passing year. "Why did you really come here?" he asked. And don't tell me about the old man and his advice. I want to know why you kept walking. 2 days through the mountains, alone, with nothing but kitchen supplies on your back. Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you give up? Clara considered the question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. Because giving up would have meant my husband was right, she said finally. Thomas spent 7 years telling me I was nothing without him. That I couldn't survive on my own. That I was lucky he'd chosen me. That I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw my way. When he died and the truth came out, all the lies, all the debts, all the ways he'd used me, I had a choice. I could prove him right by lying down and letting the world crush me. Or I could prove him wrong by getting up and keeping going, no matter how much it hurt. So you walked. So I walked. And when I couldn't walk anymore, I crawled. And when I couldn't crawl, I rested until I could walk again. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm not brave, Mr. Hartman. I'm not special. I'm just too stubborn to let a dead man win. Something shifted in Caleb's face, a crack in the stone, a flicker of something that might have been recognition. He understood stubbornness, she realized. He understood using sheer force of will to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop. The week is over, he said. You've proven yourself. Does that mean I can stay? It means you've earned a month. After that, we'll talk again. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but Clara hadn't expected warmth. She'd expected fairness, and fairness was what she'd received. A month was enough. A month was more than enough to prove that she belonged here, that she could contribute something valuable to this broken place and these broken people. Thank you, she said. Caleb nodded once sharply and turned to leave. He'd taken 3 steps when he paused, his back still to her. The garden, he said without turning around. If you wanted to work on it during your rest days, I wouldn't object. Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner of the house, leaving Clara alone with the ghosts of roses and the first tentative seeds of something she couldn't yet name. The second week brought the return of the cattle drive, and with it, the ranch's foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Samuel Cole, Henry's father. He had the same sun-bleached hair as his son, though his was shot through with silver, and the same easy manner, though tempered by decades of hard experience. Samuel took one bite of Clara's beef stew and set down his spoon with an expression of profound gratitude. Ma'am, he said, I don't know where you came from or how you ended up here, but I'm going to make sure you never leave. Clara smiled despite herself. That's quite a commitment after one bowl of stew. You don't understand. We've been eating trail food for 2 weeks, hardtack, jerky, beans cooked over open fires until they taste like smoke and sadness. I dreamed about food like this. Actual dreams where I was sitting at a real table eating a real meal, and then I'd wake up with a mouthful of dust and disappointment. He took another bite, closing his eyes in exaggerated bliss. This isn't just stew. This is a religious experience. The other men laughed, and even Caleb's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile before it disappeared behind his usual mask. Clara served seconds and thirds, watching the exhausted cattle drivers fill their bellies and let the tension drain from their shoulders. This was what she'd wanted, she realized. This was what her mother had meant about food being dignity, about cooking being an act of love. These men had spent weeks in the wilderness, battling weather and terrain and the endless stubborn stupidity of cattle, and now they were home. Clara's food was the first tangible proof of that homecoming, the first comfort after weeks of hardship. She mattered here, not as Thomas's wife, not as a woman defined by her husband's success or failure, but as herself. Clara, a person with skills and value and a place in the world. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She'd spent so long being nothing that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be something. After dinner, Clara was washing dishes when Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd cleaned up from the trail, shaved, changed his clothes, combed his hair, and he looked like a different man from the dust-covered figure who'd ridden in that afternoon. Got a minute? He asked. Clara dried her hands on her apron. Of course. Samuel stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind him, a gesture that immediately made Clara wary. She'd learned to be cautious of closed doors and private conversations. Thomas had taught her that, though not in any way he'd intended. I wanted to thank you, Samuel said, and Clara relaxed slightly at the sincere tone of his voice. Not just for the food, though God knows that's worth thanking. I wanted to thank you for what you've done for this place since you arrived. I've only been here a week and a half. I haven't done much beyond cooking. You've done more than you know. Samuel leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. Henry told me about the changes. The men laughing again, actually looking forward to meals instead of dreading them. The boss eating full plates, showing up to the table on time instead of skipping meals entirely. He paused, his weathered face serious. Before you came, I was worried this ranch wouldn't survive another year. Not because of money or cattle or land, we've got plenty of all that. I was worried because a ranch is only as strong as the people who run it, and our people were falling apart. Clara didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Caleb Hartman is the best cattleman I've ever known, Samuel continued. I've worked for him for 15 years, watched him build this place from almost nothing into one of the finest ranches in the territory. But after Sarah died, he shook his head slowly. It was like watching a man drown on dry land. He went through the motions, kept the ranch running, but there was nothing inside him anymore, nothing that cared whether he lived or died. Henry told me about the fire. Then you know enough to understand what I'm saying. That man out there, the one who barely speaks and never smiles, that's not who Caleb Hartman really is. That's just the shell he built to survive. The real man is still in there somewhere, buried under all that grief and guilt. Samuel's eyes met hers with an intensity that made Clara want to look away. I think you might be able to reach him. I don't know why or how, but something about you has already started cracking those walls. I'm just cooking for him, Clara said. That's all. No, ma'am. That's not all, and I think you know it. Samuel pushed himself off the counter and moved toward the door. I'm not asking you to fix him. That's not your job. And it wouldn't be fair to put that burden on you. I'm just asking you to keep doing what you're doing. Keep cooking. Keep showing up. Keep being someone who doesn't expect anything from him except honesty. That seems like a lot to ask of a cook. Samuel smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. Maybe. But you're not just a cook, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever you were before you came here, whatever you've lost, you're more than you think you are. I suspect you've always been more than you think you are. You just needed the right circumstances to show it. He left before Clara could respond, and she stood alone in the kitchen with dish soap on her hands and a strange tightness in her chest. She thought about Thomas again, about all the years he'd spent convincing her she was small and dependent and incapable. She thought about the wooden spoon in her bag, her mother's voice in her memory, the long walk through the mountains that had led her here. Maybe Samuel was right. Maybe she was more than she thought she was. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out. 3 weeks into Clara's time at the ranch, the weather turned. The crisp autumn air that had made her mornings pleasant suddenly developed teeth, bringing frosts that killed the last of the wildflowers and winds that howled through the valley like hungry wolves. Clara worked on Sarah's garden during her rest days, clearing the dead growth and preparing the beds for winter. She knew nothing would grow until spring, but there was something satisfying about the work, the physical labor that left her muscles aching, the visible progress as order emerged from chaos. She found bulbs buried beneath the weeds, tulips and daffodils that Sarah had planted years ago, still alive and waiting for warmth. She found the skeletal remains of rose bushes that would need heavy pruning but might yet be saved. Caleb never mentioned the garden again, but Clara caught him watching her sometimes from the window of the main house. He never acknowledged her gaze, never came out to speak with her during those Sunday sessions. But he watched, and Clara found herself wondering what he saw. The evening meals grew longer as the weather worsened. The men lingered at the table after eating, reluctant to venture back out into the cold, and conversation filled the dining room in a way Clara suspected it hadn't in years. They told stories, tall tales of past cattle drives, exaggerated accounts of romantic conquests, fond memories of places and people left behind. Clara listened more than she spoke, content to absorb the rhythms of their lives, the small details that made each man distinct. Mac had grown up on a plantation in Tennessee, the son of freed slaves who'd saved every penny to buy their own land. Tom had run away from home at 14 and never looked back, spending 20 years drifting before landing at the Hartman Ranch. Samuel had been married twice, widowed twice, and had sworn off love until he met his current wife, a schoolteacher in town who he claimed had worn him down with pure stubbornness. And Caleb sat at the head of the table and listened like Clara did, his face revealing nothing, his presence both central and separate. The men included him in their stories when they could, referencing shared experiences, asking for his confirmation of disputed details. He responded with nods or single words, never elaborating, never sharing stories of his own. But he stayed. That was the important thing, Clara realized. He stayed at the table long after the food was gone, nursing cups of coffee, listening to his men laugh and argue and remember. However silent he remained, he was present in a way he apparently hadn't been before. "Tell us about yourself, Mrs. Whitmore," Tom said one evening, his weathered face flushed with the warmth of a full belly and a second glass of whiskey. "You know all our histories by now. Seems only fair you share yours." Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward her, including those gray ones at the head of the table. She'd avoided this conversation for weeks, deflecting questions with vague answers and quick changes of subject. But Tom's question hung in the air like a challenge, and she sensed that her continued evasion would cost her more than the truth. "There's not much to tell," she said. "I grew up in Ohio, married young, moved west with my husband. When he died, I found myself without resources or family, so I did the only thing I could. I kept moving until I found somewhere that needed what I had to offer." "Your husband," Tom pressed. "What happened to him?" "Tom," Samuel's voice carried a warning. "That's personal." "It's all right," Clara said, though her throat tightened. "He fell from a horse. A simple accident. The kind of thing that happens every day. One moment he was alive, and the next he wasn't." "I'm sorry for your loss," Max said quietly. "Thank you." Clara busied herself with the coffee pot, using the moment to compose herself. "But I've made peace with it. My husband wasn't who I thought he was. Sometimes losing someone shows you that you never really had them at all." The table fell silent, an awkward hush that Clara hurried to fill. "But that's enough about me. Tell me more about this cattle drive you're planning for spring. I've never seen a real cattle drive, and I want to know what to expect." The conversation shifted, men grateful for the change of subject, and Clara allowed herself to breathe. She'd told the truth, technically. Thomas had fallen from a horse. Thomas hadn't been who she'd thought he was. None of her words had been lies. But they hadn't been the whole truth either, and she wondered how long she could keep the darker parts of her story locked away. That night, after the men had dispersed and the kitchen was clean, Clara found she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind batter the house, thinking about Thomas and secrets and the lies people told to survive. A soft knock at her door made her sit up, heart suddenly pounding. "Who's there?" "Caleb Hartman. May I come in?" Clara pulled a shawl around her shoulders and crossed to the door. When she opened it, Caleb stood in the dim hallway, his face half shadowed by the lamp he carried. He looked uncomfortable, uncertain, emotions she'd never seen him display. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I wanted to say that you don't have to tell them anything. The men, their questions, you don't owe them your story. Some things are private. Some things deserve to stay buried." Clara stared at him, trying to read the meaning beneath his words. "Is that why you never talk about your wife?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Yes." "I'm sorry. That was too forward." "No." He surprised her with the word. "It was honest. I appreciate honesty. It's rare enough in this world." He turned to leave, then paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Mrs. Whitmore, Clara, whatever your husband did to you, whatever he left you with, it doesn't define you. You get to decide who you are now. The past only has the power you give it." He was gone before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Clara standing in her doorway with the cold wind seeping through the cracks and a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Caleb Hartman had called her by her first name. He'd sought her out in the middle of the night to offer comfort. He'd shared more words with her in 2 minutes than he had in 3 weeks of daily meals. The walls were cracking. Samuel had been right. Clara closed her door and returned to bed, but sleep was a long time coming. When it finally arrived, she dreamed not of Thomas and his lies, but of gray eyes slowly filling with something that looked like hope. The fourth week brought the first real snow of the season, a heavy fall that blanketed the valley in white and kept everyone confined to the buildings. Clara cooked enormous meals, hot soups, fresh bread, hearty stews designed to combat the cold, and the men ate with the enthusiasm of hibernating bears storing up for winter. She'd settled into the rhythm of the ranch now, found her place within its structure. She knew when to speak and when to listen, when to push and when to retreat. She'd learned to read Caleb's silences, to distinguish between the empty ones and the ones that meant something was stirring beneath the surface. And she'd started to notice things she shouldn't have noticed. The way Caleb's hands looked when he wrapped them around a warm cup of coffee, large, capable, scarred from years of hard work. The way his voice sounded on the rare occasions he laughed at one of the men's jokes, rough and unused but genuinely amused. The way he moved through the world with a kind of coiled power, strength held in check, controlled absolutely. Thomas had been handsome in a smooth, polished way, the kind of handsome that came from knowing exactly how he looked and using it to his advantage. Caleb wasn't handsome like that. He was weathered, harsh, built for endurance rather than display. But there was something compelling about him nonetheless, something that drew Clara's attention even when she tried to look away. She told herself it was natural. She was a widow living among men, and Caleb was the only one who treated her as more than a cook. Of course she noticed him. It didn't mean anything, but she was a poor liar, even to herself. The snow continued for 3 days, piling up until the drifts reached the windows of the bunkhouse, and the men had to dig paths between buildings. Clara kept the fires burning and the food hot, and the ranch became a kind of fortress against the white wilderness outside. On the third night, the storm finally broke. Clara stepped outside after dinner to breathe air that wasn't thick with wood smoke and cooking smells, and found herself standing in a world transformed. The clouds had cleared, revealing a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible, and the snow-covered valley gleamed silver in the moonlight. Beautiful, isn't it? Clara didn't startle at Caleb's voice this time. She was beginning to expect him, to sense his presence before he spoke. It's like another world, she said, like we've been transported somewhere magic. Sarah used to say that. She loved nights like this, clear and cold, when you could see every star in heaven. He came to stand beside Clara, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that her breath caught slightly in her throat. She'd make me come out here and look, no matter how tired I was. Said a man who didn't stop to appreciate beauty would forget what he was working for. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. Caleb's voice softened. She was everything good in my life. Everything worth having. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They stood together in the silver silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and something passed between them that didn't require words. I'm going to check on the horses, Caleb said finally. Storm spooked some of them. They'll want reassurance. Do you want company? The question surprised them both. Clara felt her cheeks flush despite the cold, embarrassed by her own forwardness, but Caleb considered for a long moment before nodding once. All right. They walked through the snow together, their footsteps crunching in the silence, their breath forming clouds that mingled and dispersed. The barn loomed ahead, solid and dark against the gleaming white. And when Caleb pulled open the door, the smell of hay and horses and leather washed over them like a wave. The horses stirred at their entrance, soft nickers and the shuffle of hooves on packed earth. Caleb moved among them with practiced ease, speaking softly, running his hands along necks and flanks with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his harsh demeanor. Clara watched him, fascinated by this glimpse of the man beneath the walls. He was different here, she realized. Softer. The horses didn't care about his grief or his guilt. They only cared that he was here, that his hands were gentle, that his voice was calm. With them, he could simply be Caleb. Nothing more, nothing less. This one's yours, he said, stopping beside a chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead. If you want her. Clara approached slowly, letting the mare catch her scent. Mine? You can't live on a ranch without knowing how to ride. I'll teach you come spring. This one's gentle. She'll be patient with you while you learn. The mare snuffled at Clara's hand, her breath warm and grassy. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, stupid, irrational tears that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Thank you, she managed. You've earned it. Caleb turned away, continuing his rounds. Everything you've done these past weeks, the way you've changed things here, it hasn't gone unnoticed. I haven't done anything special, just cooked. Caleb laughed then, a real laugh that echoed in the barn and made the horses prick their ears. Just cooked. Is that what you think? Isn't it? He turned back to face her, and in the dim light of the barn, his gray eyes weren't empty at all. They were full, blazing with something that made Clara's heart stutter in her chest. You've done more than cook, he said. You've reminded these men what a home feels like. You've reminded me what it feels like to sit at my own table and not dread every meal. He took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. You've made me remember that there might be reasons to keep going beyond just obligation. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there, caught in the gravity of his gaze. Mr. Hartman. Caleb. My name is Caleb. Caleb. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her shiver. I'm not. I know. He stepped back, breaking the spell, and Clara could suddenly breathe again. I'm not asking anything of you. I just wanted you to know that what you've done matters. That you matter. Whatever your husband made you believe about yourself, he was wrong. He walked past her toward the barn door, and Clara stood frozen among the horses, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the whole valley could hear it. At the door, Caleb paused. Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow's another day. Then he was gone, swallowed by the silver night, and Clara was left alone with the horses and the hay, and a feeling she couldn't name. Something bright and terrifying and full of dangerous possibility. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed and watched the stars through her tiny window and thought about gray eyes and gentle hands and the way her name had sounded in his rough voice. She thought about Thomas, cold in his grave, and the years she'd wasted on a man who'd never deserved her. She thought about fire and loss and the long, slow work of rebuilding from ashes. And she thought about Caleb Hartman, broken and silent and somehow still fighting, and she wondered if two damaged people could ever make each other whole. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the first whispers of another storm approaching from the west. Clara pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes, and the last thought she had before sleep finally claimed her was that whatever was coming, storm or spring, heartbreak or hope, she would face it standing up. She'd come too far to do anything else. The second storm came 3 days later, fiercer than the first, bringing winds that screamed through the valley like something alive and angry. Clara woke to the sound of shutters banging against the house and the distant, terrified screaming of horses. She dressed quickly in the dark, fingers fumbling with buttons, and ran toward the kitchen to find the entire ranch already in chaos. Men rushed past the windows, dark shapes against the driving snow, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Clara pressed her face to the glass and saw lanterns bobbing through the white darkness, their light barely penetrating the storm. Something was wrong. Something beyond the weather. The kitchen door burst open and Henry stumbled in, snow crusting his eyebrows and fear wild in his eyes. "Fire!" he gasped. "The barn's on fire!" Clara's blood turned to ice. "How? In this storm?" "Lightning. Hit the roof, caught the hay before anyone could react. The horses are trapped inside." Clara was already moving, grabbing her shawl from the hook by the door. Henry caught her arm, his grip desperate. "You can't go out there. The boss gave orders. Everyone who isn't fighting the fire stays inside where it's safe." "Where is Caleb?" Henry's face told her everything. The color drained from his cheeks, and his grip on her arm loosened. "He was the first one in. Soon as he saw the flames, he ran straight for the barn. We couldn't stop him." Clara pulled free and pushed through the door into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and stinging her exposed skin. Snow drove into her eyes, blinding her, but she could see the orange glow ahead, could hear the roar of flames fighting against the wind, and the terrible screaming of the horses trapped inside. The barn was a nightmare made real. Flames climbed the wooden walls despite the snow, fed by the dry hay stored in the loft, casting dancing shadows across the chaos below. Men ran in every direction, some hauling buckets of snow, others trying to open stall doors and free the panicking animals. Through the smoke and fire, Clara could see shapes moving inside the burning structure. Human shapes. risking everything to save the horses. She spotted Caleb immediately. He was in the heart of the inferno, wrestling with a stall door that had jammed shut, a massive draft horse rearing and kicking behind him. The flames were closing in, eating through the walls, dropping burning debris from above. And Caleb wasn't moving. He stood frozen, his hands still on the door, his entire body rigid as stone. Clara understood in an instant. The fire. The trapped creature. The memory of another night, another blaze, another desperate attempt at rescue that had ended in ashes and grief. He was reliving it. Right there, surrounded by flames, Caleb Hartman was trapped not in the burning barn, but in the prison of his own memories. Clara didn't think. She ran. The heat hit her first, a wall of scorching air that seared her lungs and made her eyes water. She ducked under a falling beam, dodged a spray of sparks, and reached Caleb's side just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. "Caleb!" She grabbed his arm, felt the muscles locked beneath her fingers. "Caleb, look at me!" He didn't respond. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something that wasn't there. Something that had happened 3 years ago in a different barn on a different terrible night. His lips were moving, forming words she couldn't hear over the roar of the fire, and Clara realized with a jolt of horror that he was saying a name. Sarah. "She's not here," Clara shouted, gripping his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Caleb, Sarah's not here, but you are, and I am, and these horses need you. Come back to me. Come back right now." Something flickered in his gray eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just the instinct to respond to a voice calling his name. "The horses," Clara pressed. "They're going to die if we don't get them out. You have to help me. I can't do this alone." Another beam fell, showering them with sparks. The draft horse screamed, and the sound seemed to cut through whatever trance had held Caleb prisoner. He blinked, once, twice, and then his hands were moving again, attacking the jammed door with renewed strength. "The hinges!" he shouted. "They're bent from the heat. We need to break them." Clara looked around wildly and spotted a length of iron pipe lying among the debris. She grabbed it, ignoring the way it seared her palms, and thrust it toward Caleb. He took it without question and wedged it against the lower hinge, putting all his weight behind it. The metal groaned. The hinge held. "Again!" Clara screamed. Caleb threw himself against the pipe, and this time the hinge gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The door sagged open enough for the draft horse to force its way through, nearly trampling them both in its desperate flight toward the barn's main entrance. But there were more horses still trapped. Claire could see them in their stalls, rearing and screaming, their eyes rolling white with terror. And the fire was spreading, consuming the barn with a hunger that nothing could satisfy. "The back door!" Caleb shouted. "It leads to the paddock. If we can get it open, they can escape that way." He grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her through the smoke, ducking under burning rafters, dodging falling debris. The heat was unbearable now, pressing against them from all sides, stealing the air from their lungs. Clara's eyes streamed with tears and her throat burned with every breath, but she kept moving, kept following Caleb's lead through the hellscape the barn had become. The back door was barred from the outside, a security measure that had become a death sentence. Caleb threw himself against it once, twice, 3 times, but the heavy timber held firm. "It won't budge," he gasped. "It's too thick, too solid." Clara looked around, searching for anything that could help. Her gaze landed on a window beside the door, its glass already shattered by the heat. It was small, barely big enough for a person to fit through, but it was an opening. "Boost me up," she said. Caleb stared at her. "What?" "The window. I can fit through it. Get outside, lift the bar from the other side." "Clara, no. The fire's too close. If you get stuck, then we all die anyway." She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Trust me. Please." Something passed between them in that moment, something that went beyond words or reason. Caleb looked at her with those gray eyes, no longer empty, no longer closed off, and Clara saw everything he couldn't say. The fear, the hope, the desperate need to believe that this time would be different. He nodded. Caleb lifted her like she weighed nothing, boosting her toward the broken window. Clara felt the jagged glass tear at her arms as she squeezed through, felt the heat of the flames licking at her legs, but she kept pushing, kept squirming, until suddenly she was through and falling into the blessedly cold snow outside. She hit the ground hard and lay stunned for a moment, the wind screaming around her, the cold a shock after the inferno inside. Then she was on her feet, scrambling toward the door, her frozen fingers fumbling with the heavy wooden bar that held it closed. It wouldn't move. The bar was wedged tight, swollen from years of weather or perhaps warped by the heat bleeding through the door. Clara pulled with all her strength, feeling her muscles strain, feeling the hopelessness rising in her chest. "Clara!" Caleb's voice came from inside, muffled by the door. "The roof's coming down. You have to move faster." Clara screamed in frustration and threw herself against the bar again. Her hands were bleeding now, torn by the glass and the rough wood, but she didn't care. All she could think about was Caleb on the other side of that door, Caleb and the horses. Caleb who had already lost everything once and couldn't lose again. The bar moved, just an inch at first, then another. Then suddenly it was sliding free, falling to the snow-covered ground with a thud that Clara barely heard over the roar of the fire. She grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door swung open and Caleb burst through, followed by a stampede of terrified horses. Clara threw herself aside, pressing against the barn wall as the animals thundered past, their hooves churning the snow, their screams of terror mixing with the howl of the wind. And then Caleb's arms were around her, pulling her away from the burning structure, half carrying her through the snow as the barn began its final collapse. They ran, or tried to run, stumbling and sliding in the deep drifts, and behind them the barn groaned and screamed and finally fell in on itself, sending a column of sparks spiraling up into the storm. They collapsed in the snow a safe distance away, both gasping for breath, both shaking with cold and shock and the aftermath of terror. Claire could feel the ice crystals melting against her scorched skin, could feel her heartbeat slowly returning to something approaching normal, could feel Caleb's arms still around her, holding her close like he was afraid she might disappear. "You saved them," she whispered. "We saved them." His voice was hoarse, ravaged by smoke. "You came for me. When I froze, when I couldn't move, you came for me. I couldn't let you burn." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her, and Clara saw that his cheeks were wet. She didn't know if it was from melting snow or tears, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious, something miraculous, something he'd never expected to find. "Sarah died because I wasn't here," he said, the words ripped from somewhere deep inside him. "I was in town, buying supplies that could have waited, and by the time I got back, she was already gone. I've spent 3 years wishing I'd been here, wishing I'd been the one to run into those flames, wishing I'd died instead of her. Caleb, but tonight you were here. Tonight, when I was lost in the past, when I couldn't see anything but that other fire, that other barn, you brought me back. You gave me something to live for when I'd forgotten there was anything worth living for at all." He was shaking, Clara realized, not from cold, but from the release of grief he'd been holding back for 3 years. The walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, broken down by fire and fear and this strange, powerful thing that had grown between them. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe they moved together, drawn by an instinct older than words. But suddenly, his forehead was pressed against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air, and Clara felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. "I thought I was done," Caleb whispered. "I thought I'd never feel anything again. And then you walked onto my ranch with a cracked pot and a wooden spoon and started making me remember what it meant to be alive." "I was dead too," Clara admitted. "Thomas killed something in me long before he died. I'd forgotten that I was worth anything, that I deserved anything better than the scraps he threw me." "You deserve everything." Caleb's hands cupped her face, his thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks. "You deserve a home, a life, a man who sees you for what you really are. And I know I'm broken. I know I'm not what you deserve. But if you'll let me try, if you'll give me time, I want to be better. I want to be worthy of you." Clara looked into his gray eyes and saw not emptiness but possibility. She saw the man he'd been before grief destroyed him, and the man he could become if given the chance. She saw someone who had walked through fire and survived, just like her. "We're both broken," she said. "Maybe that's why we fit." Around them, the storm continued to rage. The barn was a pile of smoldering ruins, sending up smoke that the wind immediately tore away. Men were gathering the scattered horses, their shouts and whistles cutting through the howl of the weather. But in this small pocket of snow and cold and unexpected warmth, none of that mattered. They rose together, leaning on each other for support, and made their way back toward the main house. Clara's hands throbbed with pain and her lungs ached from the smoke, but she barely noticed. All she could feel was Caleb's arm around her shoulders, solid and steady, holding her upright when her legs threatened to give way. They reached the porch just as the kitchen door burst open and the men came flooding out, their faces a mix of relief and concern. Samuel reached them first, taking in their scorched clothes and smoke-stained faces with eyes that seemed to understand far more than was said. "The horses?" Caleb asked, his voice still raw. "All accounted for. Some minor burns and a lot of scared animals, but nothing that won't heal." Samuel's gaze moved from Caleb to Clara and back again. "The barn's a total loss, but barns can be rebuilt." "Yes," Caleb said quietly, looking at Clara with something like wonder in his eyes. "Things can be rebuilt." The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and repair. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and white, and the men immediately set to work salvaging what they could from the barn's remains. It wasn't much. The fire had been too fierce, too hungry, but they pulled out charred tools and twisted hardware and anything else that might be useful. Clara threw herself into her work with renewed energy, cooking massive meals to fuel the recovery effort. Her hands were bandaged, her arms scratched and healing, but she refused to rest. There was too much to do, too many people depending on her, and she needed the distraction. Every time she stopped moving, she remembered the feeling of Caleb's arms around her, the pressure of his forehead against hers, the raw honesty in his voice when he'd spoken of wanting to be worthy of her. Nothing had happened since that night. No stolen glances, no private conversations, no acknowledgement of what had passed between them in the snow. Caleb had retreated behind his walls again, not completely, but enough that Clara couldn't tell if he regretted what he'd said or simply didn't know how to move forward. She understood the hesitation. Whatever was growing between them was fragile, new, easily damaged by too much too soon. They'd both been broken by people who'd claimed to love them, and they'd both learned the hard way that love could be a cage as easily as a gift. But understanding didn't stop the ache in her chest when she saw him across the dining table. Understanding didn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered, maybe it was all just the heat of the moment. Maybe he didn't really mean it. Maybe she was foolish to hope for anything more. On the 5th day after the fire, Samuel approached Clara in the kitchen with an expression that immediately set her on edge. "Can we talk?" he asked. Clara set down the bread she'd been kneading and wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly. It's just—" Samuel hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Some of the men have been talking about what happened during the fire, about you and the boss." Clara's heart sank. "What are they saying?" "They're saying you saved his life. That when he froze up, when the memories took hold of him, you were the one who pulled him out of it. They're saying that Barn would have killed him if not for you." "I just did what anyone would have done." "No, ma'am, that's not true, and we both know it." Samuel's weathered face softened. "What you did took courage, real courage, the kind most people never find even when they need it most. You ran into a burning building to save a man you've known for a month. That's not ordinary. That's not what anyone would have done." Clara didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. "The men respect you," Samuel continued. "They already did because of your cooking and your work ethic and the way you've changed this place. But now they respect you for something more. They see you as one of us, Mrs. Whitmore, part of the ranch, part of the family. And they're hoping, we're all hoping, that you'll stay." "Where else would I go?" Samuel smiled, but there was knowing in his eyes. "That's not really what I'm asking. I'm asking if you're planning to stay here, on this ranch, with the boss. I'm asking what happened between you two in the snow after the fire and what it means for the future." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's a very personal question." "It is. And I wouldn't ask it if I didn't think the answer mattered, but I've known Caleb Hartman for 15 years. I've watched him grieve, watched him close himself off, watched him turn into a ghost haunting his own life. And then I watched him come out of that barn with his arm around you, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked alive." Samuel leaned closer, his voice dropping. Whatever happened between you two, don't give up on it. He needs time, he needs patience, but he also needs someone to fight for him, someone to show him he's worth fighting for. Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Caleb himself walked in. He stopped short when he saw them standing close together, their conversation clearly interrupted mid-sentence. His expression flickered, uncertainty, maybe, or jealousy, before settling back into its usual guarded neutrality. Am I interrupting something? No, boss. Samuel stepped back, casual as always. Just discussing meal plans for the week. I'll leave you to it. He was gone before Clara could protest, slipping out the back door with the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Clara was left alone with Caleb, the kitchen suddenly feeling very small and very warm. Meal plans? Caleb asked, one eyebrow raised. He was being diplomatic. Samuel's never diplomatic. It's one of his worst qualities. Caleb moved closer and Clara caught her breath at the intensity in his eyes. What were you really talking about? Clara considered lying. It would be easy enough, a small deflection to preserve her pride and avoid an uncomfortable conversation. But she'd had enough of lies. They'd nearly destroyed her once, and she wasn't going to let them take root again. He was asking about us, she said, about what happened after the fire. Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I've been thinking about that too. And? And I meant what I said, every word of it. He took another step closer, close enough that Clara could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to count the silver threads in his dark hair. I know I'm not good at this. I know I've been avoiding you, trying to figure out how to move forward without destroying what we have. But the truth is, I don't want to go back to who I was before you came here. I don't want to spend the rest of my life sealed up in my own grief, pushing away anyone who gets too close. Clara's heart was pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. What do you want? I want to try. I want to take whatever this is between us and see where it leads. I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be in my kitchen, at my table, in my life. He reached out and took her bandaged hand in his, careful not to press on the healing wounds. I want to deserve you, Clara, even if it takes the rest of my life. She should have been cautious. She should have protected herself, kept her distance, demanded time to think. That's what a smart woman would do. A woman who'd learned the hard way that men's promises were often just weapons in disguise. But Clara was tired of being cautious. She was tired of protecting herself so thoroughly that she couldn't feel anything at all. She'd walked through fire for this man, and she'd do it again if she had to. I'm not asking you to deserve me, she said. I'm just asking you to try. Caleb's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, gentle despite the roughness of his skin. I can do that. Good. Clara smiled, feeling something ease in her chest, some tension she'd been carrying since Thomas's death, maybe since before, since the early days of her marriage when she'd first started to realize that the man she'd chosen didn't love her. Then we start there. We try. We see what happens. No promises we can't keep. No lies we can't live with. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. It wasn't a declaration of love. They weren't ready for that, not yet. But it was a promise of something, a beginning, a chance. Have dinner with me tonight, he said. Not at the table with the men, just us, in the parlor. I'll build a fire, and you can tell me about your life before, and I'll tell you about mine, and we'll figure out what comes next. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to be steady. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, Clara and Caleb sat together in the parlor of the main house. True to his word, Caleb had built a fire in the stone hearth, and its warm light filled the room with dancing shadows. They sat on a worn leather sofa, close enough to touch, but not quite touching, and they talked. Clara told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her mother's garden and her father's quiet strength, and the way their small home had always smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. She told him about meeting Thomas, about being dazzled by his charm and swept up in his promises of adventure and security. She told him about the slow realization that those promises were empty, that the man she'd married was a ghost in a handsome suit, incapable of real feeling or honest connection. He never hit me, she said, staring into the fire. People always ask that, like physical violence is the only kind that counts. But there are other ways to hurt someone. He made me small, made me doubt everything I knew about myself, made me believe I was lucky to have him, that no one else would ever want me, that I was nothing without him. Caleb's jaw tightened. He was a fool. He was a coward. That's worse, I think. A fool can learn. A coward just keeps hiding. Clara shook her head slowly. When he died, and the debts came out, I wasn't even surprised. That's the saddest part. I'd known for years that something was wrong, that the life we were living was built on sand. I just didn't want to see it, so I closed my eyes and pretended, and by the time I opened them again, everything was already gone. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. Sarah was the opposite. Open, honest, incapable of pretense. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was sunshine. He smiled, a sad, distant expression that made Clara's heart ache. I met her at a barn dance when I was 23. She was 17, the prettiest girl in the county, and when she laughed, I swear the stars came out early just to hear her. How long were you married? 8 years. Not long enough. Not nearly long enough. Caleb's gaze dropped to his hands, clasped loosely in his lap. We tried for children, but it never happened. She wanted them so badly, used to talk about filling this house with little voices and tiny footsteps. I think losing that hope, year after year, wore on her more than she ever admitted. Clara reached out and covered his hands with hers. I'm sorry. The night she died, she'd been so happy. The mare was foaling, and after all those years of watching animals give birth and grieving that she couldn't do the same, she'd finally made peace with it. She told me that morning that maybe children weren't meant for us, but that didn't mean we couldn't have family. She said the ranch was our family, the hands, the animals, the land itself. His voice cracked. And then she went into that barn to help bring new life into the world, and she never came out. Clara tightened her grip on his hands. She didn't speak. There were no words adequate to touch that kind of pain. She just held on, letting him feel that he wasn't alone, that someone was there in the darkness with him. For 3 years I blamed myself, Caleb continued. If I'd been here, if I'd gone into the barn instead of her, if I'd been faster, stronger, better, if I'd been any of those things, she might still be alive. That's what I told myself every morning when I woke up, and every night before I finally managed to sleep. I'd failed her. I'd failed the one person in the world I was supposed to protect. It wasn't your fault. I know that. Logically, rationally, I know it. Lightning strikes where it strikes. The fire spread faster than anyone could have predicted. There was nothing I could have done differently that would have changed the outcome. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes with a rawness that stole her breath. But knowing something and believing it are different things. I've spent 3 years knowing I'm not to blame and believing I am anyway. Clara held his gaze. What do you believe now? Caleb was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped, sending up a shower of sparks that faded into the darkness of the chimney. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I believe Sarah would have liked you. She had a gift for seeing the truth of people, for looking past the surface and finding what was really there. She would have seen your strength, your stubbornness, your refusal to be broken by the world. He raised one hand to Clara's face, his fingers brushing her cheek with infinite gentleness. I believe she would have wanted me to keep living, not just existing. I believe she would have been angry with me for sealing myself away all this time, for letting grief turn me into a ghost. And now? Now I'm trying to be human again. It's harder than I expected. He smiled slightly, the expression softening the harsh lines of his face. But you make it easier. You make everything easier. They sat together as the fire burned down to embers, talking about everything and nothing, their hopes, their fears, the small daily details of their lives. Clara told him about the garden she'd been restoring, about finding Sarah's bulbs buried under years of neglect. Caleb told her about the new barn they were planning, about the improvements he wanted to make, about his dreams for the ranch's future. There's room to grow, he said. More land to acquire, more cattle to raise. This place could be twice what it is now if someone was willing to put in the work. It sounds like you've been planning for a while. Planning, yes, but not believing. Not really. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Plans are easy. Anyone can make plans. It's the believing that's hard, the conviction that the future is worth working toward. For 3 years, I didn't have that. I went through the motions, kept the ranch running, but I didn't believe any of it mattered. What changed? You. The word was simple, direct, carrying the weight of absolute truth. You walked onto my ranch with nothing but a bag of kitchen tools and a refusal to give up. You cooked your way into my men's hearts and started thawing out a house that had been cold for 3 years. You ran into a burning barn to save me from my own memories. He shook his head slowly. How could I not start believing again after that? Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes. She blinked them back, but her voice was unsteady when she spoke. I didn't do anything special. I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly what makes it special. Most people don't do what needs to be done. They do what's easy, what's safe, what doesn't require any risk. You chose differently. Every single time, you chose differently. Caleb took both her hands in his grip firm and warm. I'm not a man who makes speeches, Clara. I'm not good with words, not like Sarah was. But I want you to know that what you've done for this ranch, what you've done for me, it matters. It will always matter. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its soft tones breaking the spell of the moment. Clara suddenly realized how late it had gotten, how long they'd been sitting together, how far they'd traveled from polite employer and employee to something much more complex and promising. I should go, she said reluctantly. The morning comes early, and there's bread to bake. Let it wait. Caleb didn't release her hands. For once, let the work wait. Stay a little longer. So she stayed. They talked until the fire was nothing but glowing coals, until the cold began to creep back into the room, until their words grew slow and drowsy and comfortable. And when Clara finally rose to leave, Caleb walked her to the kitchen door and stood with her on the threshold of her small room. Tomorrow night? He asked. Same time? Same time. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. Sleep well, Clara. She didn't sleep well. Her mind was too full of him, of his words, of the feeling of his hands holding hers. But when she finally drifted off as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through her tiny window, she was smiling. They were trying. They were figuring it out. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara allowed herself to believe that the future might hold something worth wanting. The weeks that followed were the happiest Clara could remember. She and Caleb fell into a rhythm, spending their evenings together in the parlor, sharing stories and dreams, and the quiet comfort of companionship. The men noticed the change in their boss. How could they not? And responded with a mixture of relief and gentle teasing. You're almost pleasant these days, Mac observed one morning, his weathered face creased with amusement. It's unsettling. Caleb's mouth twitched. I'll try to be more disagreeable. Please don't. I'm just saying it takes some getting used to, that's all. Mac winked at Clara, who was setting out the breakfast dishes. Whatever magic you're working, ma'am, keep it up. This is the best I've seen him in years. The garden began to show signs of life as spring approached. Clara spent her rest days pruning the rose bushes and turning the soil, preparing for the bulbs she hoped would bloom when the warm weather finally arrived. Sometimes Caleb would join her, working in companionable silence, his strong hands tackling the harder tasks while Clara focused on the delicate work. Sarah would have done this differently, he said one afternoon, watching Clara carefully prune a rosebush. She had a system, a method. I never understood it, but everything she touched seemed to grow. Maybe she'll guide my hands, Clara said quietly. Teach me what I need to know. Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. You talk about her like she's still here. In a way, she is. Her garden, her house, her influence on everyone who knew her, she's woven into the fabric of this place. I can feel it when I cook in her kitchen, when I sit in her parlor, when I walk the paths she walked. She's not gone, Caleb. She's just transformed. Part of the land now, part of the legacy you're building. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I never thought of it that way. Maybe you weren't ready to. Maybe it takes time to see loss as anything other than absence. Clara set down her pruning shears and turned to face him. I'm not trying to replace her. I could never replace her, but maybe I can help carry the weight of her memory. Maybe we can honor what she built instead of just grieving what we lost." Caleb reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her close in the middle of the garden that his wife had planted. Clara felt his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong, and she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't something that happened to other people. Maybe it could happen to her too. The world beyond the ranch continued to turn, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in the mountain valley. Spring began its slow approach, melting the snow and filling the streams with rushing water. The cattle grew restless, eager to move to higher pastures, and the men began preparing for the work ahead. And through it all, Clara and Caleb continued to build something new from the ruins of their old lives. Not replacing what had been lost, but creating something different, something that belonged only to them. They weren't ready to name it yet. The word love felt too heavy, too fraught with the ghosts of past mistakes. But whatever it was, this fragile, growing thing between them, it was real. Real enough to hope for, real enough to fight for, real enough to believe in, even when the darkness tried to convince them otherwise. Clara stood at the kitchen window one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and pink, and she thought about the long road that had brought her here. The grief, the loss, the desperate walk through the wilderness with nothing but 3 kitchen items and a stubborn refusal to surrender. She'd come to this ranch with empty pockets and a broken heart, expecting nothing more than a chance to survive. She'd found something so much bigger than survival. She'd found a home. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket, comfortable and true. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the future held, she knew she would face them from a place of strength. Because Clara Whitmore was no longer a woman with nothing. She was a woman who had built something beautiful from ashes, and she would fight with everything she had to protect it. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in the mountains, teasing warmth one day and retreating into cold the next. But the signs were unmistakable. The snow melting from the lower pastures, the streams swelling with runoff, the first green shoots pushing through the softening earth. Clara watched the transformation from her kitchen window each morning, marveling at the resilience of the land, its stubborn insistence on rebirth no matter how harsh the winter had been. The garden responded to her care with equal stubbornness. The rose bushes she'd pruned so carefully began to show new growth, tiny red leaves unfurling along the stems like promises of beauty to come. And the bulbs, Sarah's bulbs, buried and forgotten for 3 years, pushed through the soil in neat rows, their green spears reaching toward the strengthening sun. "Tulips," Caleb said one evening, standing beside Clara in the garden as the last light faded from the sky. "Red ones. Sarah planted them the year we got married. Said they reminded her of passion, of the kind of love that burns bright and never fades." Clara looked at the emerging shoots with new understanding. They survived all this time, buried under the neglect, waiting for someone to care for them again. "Like you." Caleb's voice was soft. "Like me. Like everything on this ranch that was just waiting to come back to life." She leaned into him, feeling his arm wrap around her shoulders, and they stood together in the growing darkness until the first stars appeared overhead. The new barn was taking shape, rising from the ashes of the old one beam by beam. The men worked long hours, racing to complete the structure before the spring cattle drive began, and Clara kept them fueled with hearty meals and strong coffee. She'd fallen into an easy rhythm with the ranch hands now, trading jokes with Mac and listening to Tom's endless complaints and watching Henry grow from a boy into a man before her eyes. "You're different," Henry told her one morning, helping her carry supplies from the root cellar. "Happier, more settled, like you finally believe you belong here." "Maybe I do." "No, maybe about it." Henry grinned, his sun-bleached hair falling into his eyes. "The boys have been talking. They're taking bets on when the boss will make it official." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Make what official?" "You know." Henry waggled his eyebrows suggestively. "The thing that everyone can see but nobody's supposed to talk about. The way he looks at you across the dinner table. The way you both disappear into the parlor every evening and don't come out until midnight." "We're just talking." "Sure you are." Henry's grin widened. "That's why he's whistling now. Caleb Hartman, who hasn't made a sound above a grunt in 3 years, whistling while he works. Just talking." "Right." Clara swatted at him with a dish rag, but she couldn't keep the smile from her face. It was true. Something had shifted between her and Caleb in the weeks since the fire. The walls were still there, but they had doors now, and those doors were opening more and more each day. They hadn't kissed. They hadn't done anything more than hold hands and share the occasional embrace. But the intimacy between them went deeper than physical contact. They knew each other now, really knew each other, with all the broken pieces and jagged edges that entailed. And somehow, that knowing had made the wanting sharper, more urgent, harder to ignore. Clara lay awake at night thinking about his hands, about his mouth, about the way his body felt pressed against hers when they hugged goodbye at the end of each evening. She imagined what it would be like to close the distance between them, to let the heat that simmered beneath every interaction finally ignite. But she held back. They both held back. Because whatever was building between them was too important to rush, too precious to risk with premature action. They were building something that would last, something that could weather storms, and that kind of foundation required patience. The cattle drive preparations intensified as spring took hold. Samuel organized the men into teams, assigning responsibilities and mapping routes and stockpiling supplies. Clara found herself caught up in the logistics, cooking, and preserving food that would travel well, making sure the men had everything they needed for weeks on the trail. "You should come with us," Samuel said one afternoon, surprising her with the suggestion. "See what a real drive looks like. It's hard work, but there's nothing like it. Sleeping under the stars, moving with the herd, feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Clara laughed. "I can barely stay on a horse. I'd be more hindrance than help. The boss has been teaching you. I've seen you in the corral getting more comfortable every day. By the time we're ready to move out, you'll be good enough to keep up." It was true that Caleb had been giving her riding lessons, patient instruction that had transformed her from a nervous novice into something approaching competence. The chestnut mare, whom Clara had named Penny for her copper coloring, had proven to be as gentle and patient as Caleb had promised, tolerating Clara's mistakes with equine forbearance. "Think about it," Samuel said. "The boss would like having you there, and the men would appreciate having a real cook instead of trail food for a change." Clara promised to consider it, though she already knew she wouldn't go. The ranch would need someone to look after things while the men were away, and besides, she wasn't ready to leave this place that had become her home. Not yet. Not when she'd only just begun to feel like she truly belonged. The preparations continued, and Clara threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She wanted the men to remember her cooking while they were on the trail, wanted them to come back hungry for her meals, wanted to prove that her place on this ranch was earned and valuable. She was in the kitchen one evening, kneading bread for the next day's breakfast, when Caleb appeared in the doorway. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he'd been thinking about something serious, working through some internal debate before bringing it to her. "Clara." She set down the dough and wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" Caleb crossed to her, his movements deliberate, his gray eyes locked on her face. He stopped just inches away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that her pulse began to quicken. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "about us, about what this is, and what I want it to be." Clara's breath caught. And I realized that I've been holding back, protecting myself, protecting you, telling myself we needed more time. But time isn't the issue. He reached up and cupped her face in his calloused hands, his touch impossibly gentle. "The issue is fear. I'm afraid of loving you because I know what it feels like to lose someone you love. I'm afraid that if I let myself have this, really have it, something will come along and tear it away." "Caleb, let me finish." His thumbs traced slow circles on her cheekbones, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm afraid. I'll probably always be afraid, but I'm more afraid of wasting what we have because I'm too scared to reach for it. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that for me. She would have wanted me to live, really live, even if living meant risking more pain." Clara felt tears building behind her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you." The words came out rough, torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to give up on anything, including me. I love how you've brought this ranch back to life and how you've made my men remember how to laugh. I love that you ran into a burning barn because you couldn't stand the thought of losing me." He pressed his forehead against hers, their breath mingling. I love you, Clara. And I'm done being afraid to say it. The tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks and wetting his hands. Clara had dreamed of hearing those words, had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The rawness in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, the feeling of her heart expanding until it seemed too big for her chest. I love you too, she whispered. I think I've loved you since you let me cook that first meal, since you gave me a chance when you had no reason to. I love your silence and your strength and the way you carry your grief like it's something precious instead of something shameful. I love that you're trying to be better, that you want to deserve me, even though you already do. Caleb made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I don't. I really don't. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life working toward it. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss, not after all those weeks of waiting and wanting. It was fierce, desperate, full of everything they'd been holding back. Clara melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressing against his as if she could somehow merge them into one being. He tasted like coffee and dust and something uniquely him, something that made her head spin and her knees weaken. They broke apart gasping, foreheads still touching, hearts racing in tandem. Well, Clara breathed. That was worth waiting for. Caleb laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and wonderful. You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that. I have some idea. She smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had in years. I've been wanting the same thing. They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the taste and feel of each other. Clara's hands found their way into his hair, and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her close, holding her like she was something precious that might slip away if he wasn't careful. When they finally separated, both breathless and slightly dazed, Clara became aware of flour dusting Caleb's dark shirt and dough still waiting on the counter. The bread, she said reluctantly. Forget the bread. The men need breakfast. The men can eat oatmeal for one day. Caleb pulled her toward the door that led to the parlor, his eyes dark with promise. Right now, I need you more than anyone needs bread. They spent the rest of the evening on the parlor sofa, wrapped in each other's arms, talking and kissing and simply being together. Clara learned the taste of his mouth, the texture of his skin, the sound he made when she pressed her lips to his throat. She learned that he was ticklish just below his ribs, and that he liked having his hair stroked, and that when he laughed, really laughed, his whole face transformed into something almost boyish. And she told him things she'd never told anyone, about the loneliness of her marriage, about the slow erosion of her self-worth, about the day she'd stood in her empty house and realized that losing everything had actually set her free. She told him about her mother's death, about her father's quiet grief, about the way she'd learned to find comfort in cooking because food was the one language her broken family still spoke. You're remarkable, Caleb said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her arm. You know that, right? Everything you've survived, everything you've overcome, most people would have given up. Most people would have broken. I did break, more than once. The difference is I kept putting myself back together. That's not breaking. That's bending. He pressed a kiss to her temple. There's nothing weak about falling down, Clara. The weakness is in staying down, and you've never stayed down, not once. She thought about that. About all the times she'd fallen and risen again, about all the moments when surrender would have been easier than fighting. She thought about her mother's wooden spoon, still sitting in her room, a talisman of strength passed down through generations of women who refused to be defeated. My mother used to say that women are like willow trees, she said softly. We bend in the storm instead of breaking. We let the wind tear at us, let it strip away everything we thought we needed, and then when it passes, we straighten up again. Changed, maybe. Scarred. But still standing. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. I wish she could have met you. She would have approved. Caleb smiled, his eyes warm in the firelight. Would she? I'm not exactly a catch, a widowed rancher with a reputation for being difficult and a tendency to brood. You're exactly a catch. Clara propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. You're strong and honest and hardworking. You love deeply, even when it hurts. You've faced terrible loss and kept going instead of letting it destroy you. Those are the things that matter, not charm or polish or the ability to make small talk at parties. Thomas had charm and polish, and look how that turned out. She traced the line of his jaw with one finger. I'll take difficult and brooding over charming and hollow any day of the week. They fell asleep on the parlor sofa, tangled together under a worn quilt, the fire burning down to embers around them. Clara woke just before dawn, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings, then smiled as she felt Caleb's arms tighten around her. "Good morning," he murmured against her hair. "Good morning." She tilted her face up to receive his kiss, a soft, sleepy brush of lips that felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I should go start breakfast. 5 more minutes. The men will be hungry." "The men can wait." He pulled her closer, burying his face in her neck. "I've waited 3 years to wake up with someone in my arms. The men can survive a few more minutes." So Clara stayed, wrapped in warmth and contentment, watching the gray light of dawn creep through the windows. She thought about all the mornings she'd woken alone in her narrow bed, all the years she'd spent reaching across empty sheets for a husband who was already gone, physically or emotionally. This was different. This was a man who wanted her close, who held her like she was precious, who wasn't already plotting his escape. This was love, real love, the kind she'd stopped believing existed. Eventually, duty won out over comfort, and Clara extracted herself from Caleb's embrace to begin her morning routine. But everything felt different now. The kitchen was the same, the work was the same, but she was changed. She moved through her tasks with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, humming under her breath, smiling at nothing. When the men filed in for breakfast, they noticed immediately. "Someone's in a good mood," Mac observed, accepting his plate of eggs and bacon with raised eyebrows. "It's a beautiful morning," Claire replied serenely. Uh-huh. Mac exchanged glances with Samuel, who was hiding a smile behind his coffee cup. "Beautiful morning. That's what we're calling it." Caleb arrived a few minutes later, taking his place at the head of the table with the same quiet authority he always showed. But there was something different about him, too. A softness around his eyes, a relaxation in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The men noticed that as well, their glances flickering between their boss and their cook with knowing amusement. "So," Tom said, never one for subtlety, "you two finally figure things out?" Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Caleb merely raised an eyebrow. "Figure what out?" "Come on, boss, we're not blind. You've been circling each other for months like a pair of nervous colts. About time you stopped dancing and got on with it." "Tom." Samuel's voice carried a warning. "What? Everyone's thinking it. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took Clara's hand in his, right there at the table, in front of all his men. "Yes," he said simply. "We figured things out." The men erupted in cheers and good-natured ribbing, congratulations and jokes flying across the table. Clara stood frozen, her hand in Caleb's, overwhelmed by the acceptance and warmth flooding toward her from these men who had become her family. "About damn time," Samuel said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "To the boss and Mrs. Whitmore. May you find the happiness you both deserve." "To the boss and Mrs. Whitmore," the men echoed, and Clara felt tears threatening again, happy tears this time, the kind that came from being seen and welcomed and loved. Caleb squeezed her hand and smiled, a real smile that transformed his harsh face into something beautiful. "To Clara," he said quietly, for her ears alone, "the woman who saved my life in more ways than one." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She and Caleb fell into a new rhythm, one that included stolen kisses in the kitchen and long evenings wrapped in each other's arms. They didn't rush. There was no need to rush, not when they had all the time in the world, but the intimacy between them deepened daily, trust building on trust, love building on love. Clara moved her few belongings from the small room off the kitchen to the main house, into the bedroom that had once belonged to Caleb and Sarah. She'd worried about that, about sleeping in a dead woman's bed, about the ghost that might linger in the space. But Caleb had rearranged the furniture, brought in new quilts, made it theirs instead of his and Sarah's. "She's not here anymore," he said when Clara hesitated at the threshold. "Not in this room, anyway. She's in the garden and the kitchen and the land itself. But this room is for us, for our future, not my past." So Clara stepped inside and let herself belong there, in this room with this man, in this life she'd never dared to dream might be hers. The spring cattle drive began in late April, taking most of the men away for 3 weeks. Clara stayed behind with Caleb, who had decided to let Samuel lead the drive this year, his first time delegating that responsibility since Sarah's death. "I have more important things to attend to," he said, when Samuel raised an eyebrow at the decision. Those 3 weeks alone together were a gift Clara hadn't known she needed. With the men gone and the ranch quiet, she and Caleb had space to simply be together, without audience or expectation. They rode out together each morning to check the remaining cattle. They worked side by side in the garden, planting vegetables and tending the roses that were finally beginning to bloom. They cooked meals together, laughing at Caleb's clumsy attempts to help in the kitchen, teaching each other the small skills that made a house into a home. And at night, in the bedroom they now shared, they learned each other in ways that went beyond words. Clara had been married before, had known the physical side of love, or what she'd thought was love, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. With Thomas, intimacy had been perfunctory, a marital duty to be endured rather than enjoyed. He'd taken what he wanted with little regard for her pleasure, and she'd learned to absent herself mentally, to wait for it to be over. With Caleb, everything was different. He touched her like she was precious, like every inch of her skin was worth exploring and worshiping. He paid attention to her responses, adjusted his approach based on what made her gasp or moan or arch toward him. He made her feel beautiful, desirable, whole. "I didn't know," she whispered one night, lying in his arms with the moonlight streaming through the window. "I didn't know it could be like this." "Like what?" "Like," she struggled to find the words, "like something shared, like something we do together, instead of something done to me." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "He didn't deserve you. He never deserved you. I know that now. I'm not sure I knew it then." They lay in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds drifting through the open window, owls calling, coyotes singing, the distant lowing of cattle. Clara felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket, the kind of peace that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly the right person. "Marry me," Caleb said. Clara's heart stopped. She pushed herself up on one elbow, staring down at him in the dim light. "What?" "Marry me." He sat up, taking her hands in his gray eyes intense and earnest. "I know it's soon. I know we haven't been together long. But I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't know what I want. I want you, Clara. I want you as my wife, my partner, my family. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life, full of all the things we've both been missing." Clara's vision blurred with tears. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now. If you need time to think, if you're not ready, I understand. I'll wait as long as you need. But I wanted you to know how I feel, what I'm hoping for." He brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Clara thought about all the reasons she should hesitate. It was too soon. They'd only been together for a few months. She'd been married before, and that marriage had been a disaster. She barely knew how to be a rancher's wife, barely knew how to ride a horse, barely knew anything about this new life she'd stumbled into. But then she thought about Caleb, about his patience and his strength, his grief that he carried with dignity, his love that he'd finally allowed himself to feel again. She thought about the ranch, the men who'd become her family, the garden she'd brought back to life, and the home she'd made in this beautiful, wild place. She thought about walking into that plaza 3 months ago with nothing but 3 kitchen items and a desperate hope. And she thought about all the impossible steps that had brought her here, to this moment, to this man. "Yes," she said. Caleb's face transformed, joy breaking through the careful control he usually maintained. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to spend my life with you. Yes to everything. She laughed through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, yes, yes. He kissed her then, long and deep and full of promise, and Clara felt the last broken pieces of her heart click back into place. She was going to be a wife again, but this time she would be a partner, not a possession. This time, she would be loved the way she deserved to be loved. This time, everything would be different. The men returned from the cattle drive to find the ranch transformed. The tulips were blooming in the garden, red as passion, just as Sarah had intended. The new barn stood complete and solid against the spring sky, and their boss was engaged to be married. The celebration that night was the loudest the ranch had seen in years. Someone produced a fiddle, someone else found a bottle of whiskey that had been saved for a special occasion, and the men danced and sang and toasted the happy couple until well past midnight. Clara stood in the middle of it all, laughing at Tom's clumsy attempts at dancing, accepting hugs and congratulations from men who had become her brothers, feeling more loved and more at home than she had ever felt in her life. Caleb found her in a quiet moment, pulling her aside as the party continued around them. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft beneath the music. Deliriously. She leaned into him, feeling his arms wrap around her. "I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was all a dream." "It's not a dream. It's real. You're real." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "And I'm never letting you go." They stood together watching their family celebrate, and Clara felt the future stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. She'd come to this ranch with nothing, a widow with empty pockets and a broken spirit. She'd found everything: love, family, purpose, home. She'd found a man worth fighting for, a life worth building, a second chance she'd never expected to receive. The fire had nearly destroyed them both, but from the ashes, something beautiful had grown. Clara looked up at Caleb, at the man who would soon be her husband, and smiled. They'd earned this happiness. Every painful step of their journeys, every loss and heartbreak and moment of despair, it had all led here, to this place, to each other, and that made it worth it. All of it. The music swelled, the stars wheeled overhead, and Clara Whitmore let herself believe finally and completely that she deserved every bit of the joy flooding through her. She was home. The wedding was set for midsummer, when the wildflowers would be at their peak and the mountain air would carry the sweet scent of blooming sage. Clara threw herself into the preparations with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she quickly discovered that planning a wedding on a working ranch was a far different matter than the formal affair she'd had with Thomas years ago. "We don't need anything fancy," Caleb said one evening, watching her sketch out seating arrangements at the kitchen table. "Just you, me, and someone to say the words. That's all that matters." "I know." Clara set down her pencil and smiled at him. "But the men have been looking forward to this. They want to celebrate. And honestly, so do I." "Then we'll celebrate." He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Whatever makes you happy." The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with 1,000 small tasks. Clara sewed her own dress from fabric she'd ordered from town, a simple cream-colored cotton that would be practical enough to wear again after the ceremony. She planned the menu herself, of course, a feast that would showcase every skill she'd learned from her mother and every technique she'd perfected in the months since arriving at the ranch. The garden became her sanctuary during those busy days. The roses were in full bloom now, their crimson petals glowing against the green leaves, their perfume filling the air with sweetness. Clara would sit on Sarah's old bench in the quiet moments between tasks, letting the peace of the space settle over her like a blessing. She thought about Sarah often, not with jealousy or resentment, but with a strange sense of gratitude. Without Sarah, there would be no garden, no ranch, no Caleb as she knew him. Sarah's life and love and loss had shaped everything about this place, had made it into the home Clara had found when she'd needed one most. "I hope you don't mind," Clara whispered one afternoon, her fingers trailing over the soft petals of a rose. "I hope you know I'm not trying to replace you. I just want to love him the way he deserves to be loved." The wind stirred the flowers, carrying their scent toward her like an answer, and Clara chose to believe it was a blessing. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the sky that particular shade of blue that only existed in the high mountains. Clara woke early, before the sun had fully crested the peaks, and lay still for a moment, savoring the last few hours of her life as Clara Whitmore. By tonight, she would be Clara Hartman. The thought filled her with a joy so fierce it almost hurt. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race beneath her palm, and smiled at the ceiling. "Today," she whispered to the empty room. "Today, everything changes." She rose and dressed carefully, taking her time with each button and ribbon. The cream-colored dress fit perfectly, skimming her curves and falling to her ankles in a gentle sweep of fabric. She'd made a simple crown of wildflowers to wear in her hair, blue columbines and white daisies woven together with sprigs of lavender. When she looked at herself in the small mirror Caleb had hung by the door, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Not because she looked different exactly, but because she looked happy. Genuinely, deeply, radiantly happy in a way she'd never seen herself before. A knock at the door made her turn. "Come in." Samuel entered, dressed in what was clearly his best shirt, his silver hair combed neatly back from his weathered face. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes widening. "Mrs. Whitmore," he breathed, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Samuel." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Is everything ready?" "Everything's perfect. The men are gathered by the garden. The preacher rode in from town an hour ago, and the boss is pacing like a caged animal waiting for you to appear." Samuel smiled, his weathered face creasing with warmth. "He asked me to escort you out. Said it didn't feel right for you to walk alone." Clara's throat tightened. She'd been prepared to walk alone, had accepted it as just another reminder that she had no family, no one to give her away. But Samuel's offer, made on Caleb's behalf, touched her more deeply than she could express. "I would be honored," she managed. Samuel offered his arm, and Clara took it, letting him lead her out of the house and toward the garden where her future waited. The scene that greeted her stole her breath. The garden had been transformed, chairs arranged in neat rows facing the trellis that Clara had restored to its former glory. Roses climbed the weathered wood, their red blooms framing the space where the preacher stood with his worn Bible. Every ranch hand was present, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best, their faces turned toward her with expressions of genuine joy. And at the front, beneath the roses, stood Caleb. He wore a dark suit that Clara had never seen before, clearly saved for occasions exactly like this one. His hair was combed, his face freshly shaved, but it was his eyes that captured her attention and held it. Those gray eyes that had been so empty when she'd first arrived, now blazing with love and hope and a future they would build together. Clara walked toward him on Samuel's steady arm, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The distance seemed both endless and impossibly short, and then she was there, standing before him, her hand in his, her whole body trembling with the magnitude of the moment. "Clara," Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "You're so beautiful." "So are you," she whispered, and meant it. The preacher cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his words washing over Clara like music. She heard them and didn't hear them, too focused on Caleb's face, on the feeling of his hands holding hers, on the certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When it came time for the vows, Caleb spoke first. "Clara," he said, his gray eyes locked on hers. "I was a dead man walking when you found me. I'd sealed myself away from everything that made life worth living, convinced that grief was all I deserved. Then you walked onto my ranch with nothing but a bag of kitchen tools and a refusal to give up, and you started bringing me back to life. One meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of stubborn courage at a time." His voice cracked, and he paused to compose himself. "I vow to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the gift you've given me. I vow to love you, honor you, and stand beside you through whatever storms may come. I vow to be the man you see when you look at me, even on the days when I can't see him myself." Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. "Caleb," she said when she could trust her voice, "I came to this ranch believing I had nothing left. I thought I was worthless, broken beyond repair, destined to spend whatever remained of my life just surviving. You showed me I was wrong, not with grand gestures or pretty words, but with small kindnesses, with patience, with the simple act of seeing me for who I really am." She squeezed his hands, feeling the warmth and strength of them. I vow to love you with everything I have. I vow to stand beside you in the good times and the bad, to build with you and dream with you and face whatever comes together. I vow to make this ranch our home, filled with love and laughter and all the things we've both been missing for too long. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed her beneath the roses, surrounded by the cheers of the men who had become their family. Clara melted into him, tasting salt from her tears and his, feeling joy rise in her chest like a wave that threatened to sweep her away. When they broke apart, breathless and laughing, the celebration began in earnest. The feast Clara had prepared was everything she'd hoped it would be: roasted beef with herbs from the garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, vegetables grown in soil she'd tended with her own hands. The men ate until they couldn't move, then somehow found room for the wedding cake Clara had spent 2 days perfecting, a towering confection of vanilla and buttercream decorated with sugar roses. "This is the best meal I've ever eaten," Mac declared, his plate scraped clean for the third time. "And I've eaten a lot of meals in my 57 years. "It's love," Tom said, surprising everyone with the sentiment. "You can taste it. Every bite. You can taste how much she loves him." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Caleb just pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her temple. "He's right," he murmured against her hair. "I've tasted that love from the very first meal you made. It's what saved me." The celebration continued into the evening, the men producing instruments and playing music that echoed across the valley. Clara danced until her feet ached, passed from partner to partner, laughing as Tom stepped on her toes, and Mac tried to teach her a complicated jig he claimed to have learned in Tennessee. But her favorite dances were with Caleb. He held her close and moved with a grace that surprised her, guiding her through steps she didn't know she knew, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy?" he asked during one quiet moment, when the music had slowed and they were swaying together in the fading light. "More than I've ever been," she admitted. "More than I thought possible." "Good." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Because this is just the beginning, Clara. We have a whole life ahead of us. I intend to make sure every day is as happy as this one." As the stars emerged overhead and the music finally faded, the men began drifting toward the bunkhouse, leaving Clara and Caleb alone in the garden. They stood among the roses, the scent of flowers and celebration lingering in the cool night air, and looked at each other with the wonder of two people who had found something they'd stopped believing existed. "Wife," Caleb said, testing the word. "Husband," Clara replied, smiling. He took her hand and led her toward the house, toward the bedroom they would share as husband and wife, toward the future they would build together. And Clara went willingly, without fear, without doubt, knowing in her bones that whatever came next, they would face it together. The summer ripened into autumn, and Clara settled into her new life with a contentment she'd never known. She was Clara Hartman now, wife of the ranch owner, mistress of the main house, part of a community that had embraced her completely. The work continued, it always continued on a ranch. But it felt different now. She wasn't just the cook anymore, though she still prepared every meal with the same care and attention. She was a partner, involved in decisions about the cattle and the land and the future of the place that had become her home. Caleb consulted her about everything, valuing her opinion even on matters she knew little about. He taught her more about ranching, about the cycles of cattle and land, about the delicate balance that kept a working ranch alive. And she taught him things too, about cooking and gardening, about the small domestic arts that turned a house into a home. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who cared about curtains," he admitted one evening, watching Clara hang new fabric at the parlor windows. "But you make me want everything to be beautiful. You make me see the beauty in things I'd stopped noticing." "That's because you're not just surviving anymore," Clara said, stepping back to examine her work. "You're living. There's a difference." "Yes." He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "There certainly is." The garden continued to flourish under Clara's care, a living tribute to Sarah and a promise for the future. The roses bloomed in waves throughout the summer, their perfume drifting through the open windows of the house. The vegetables Clara had planted yielded abundant harvests, filling the root cellar with provisions for winter. And in a corner of this garden that had been empty and forgotten, Clara planted new bulbs, tulips and daffodils and crocuses that would bloom in spring adding her own legacy to the one Sarah had left behind. She would have loved this, Caleb said one afternoon, watching Clara work. She would have loved you. I like to think so. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. I feel close to her here in this garden, like she's watching over us, glad that the ranch is alive again. The ranch isn't the only thing that's alive again. Caleb offered his hand and helped her to her feet. I was dead, Clara. For 3 years I was just going through the motions, waiting for my body to catch up with what my heart already knew. You changed that. You made me want to live again. We saved each other, Clara said softly. That's what love is, I think. Two broken people who help each other heal. Autumn brought the final cattle drive of the year, and this time Clara went along. She'd become a competent rider over the months of Caleb's patient instruction, and she wanted to see the part of ranch life that had been mysterious to her for so long. The drive was everything Samuel had promised: hard work and long hours, sleeping under stars that seemed close enough to touch, moving with the herd through landscapes so beautiful it made her heart ache. Clara cooked over open fires and rode until her muscles screamed and discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. You're a natural, Mac told her one evening, watching her guide a straying calf back to the herd. Could have sworn you were born on horseback. I was born in Ohio, Clara laughed. The closest I'd come to a horse before this year was seeing them pull carriages in town. Well, you've come a long way. The boss is lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have him. I'm lucky to have all of this. The cattle drive ended successfully. The herd delivered to market, the money deposited in the bank. Clara returned to the ranch with a new appreciation for the work that kept it running and a deeper understanding of the life she'd chosen. Winter came gently that year, the snow falling in soft flurries rather than the violent storms of the previous season. Clara and Caleb spent the long evenings by the fire, reading and talking and making plans for the future. They discussed expanding the herd, improving the buildings, perhaps even hiring more hands as the operation grew. Children, Clara asked one night, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them finally finding voice. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Sarah and I tried. It never happened for us. The doctors couldn't explain why. I'm sorry. It was a grief we shared, but we made peace with it. She used to say that maybe some couples were meant to love differently, to pour their hearts into other things. He took Clara's hand in his. If children come, they'll be welcome. If they don't, we'll still have a full life. Either way, I'm content. So am I, Clara said, and meant it. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. It was spring again, a full year since Clara had walked onto the ranch with nothing but 3 kitchen items and a desperate hope, when she began to suspect that her body was changing in ways she hadn't expected. She waited 2 months to be sure, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. She consulted the doctor in town, who confirmed what she'd begun to believe. And then, on a perfect spring evening with the tulips blooming red in the garden and the roses beginning to bud on the trellis, she told Caleb, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for and nothing she'd expected. The big, stoic rancher who rarely showed emotion sank into a chair and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Clara held him, stroking his hair, letting him release all the grief and hope and disbelief that tangled together in his heart. A baby, he finally managed. We're going to have a baby. We are. Clara smiled through her own tears. Apparently we're going to be parents. I never thought, after Sarah, I never believed. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Clara understood. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire, and the celebration that followed rivaled their wedding. The men toasted and cheered and started making elaborate plans for spoiling the child, arguing over who would teach it to ride and rope and fish. This ranch needs young ones, Samuel said, his weathered face creased with joy. It's been too quiet for too long. A baby will bring life to this place in a whole new way. Clara watched the celebration from Caleb's arms, her hand resting on her still flat belly, and felt the future stretching out before her in ways she'd never imagined. A year ago, she'd been a widow with nothing, walking through the wilderness with no destination and no hope. Now she was a wife, a rancher, and soon a mother. She was part of a community, surrounded by people who loved her, building a legacy that would outlast them all. The baby came in late autumn, after a labor that tested Clara's considerable strength and left her more exhausted than she'd ever been. But when the doctor placed the squalling infant in her arms and she looked down at the tiny face, all the pain dissolved into wonder. "A girl," Caleb breathed, tears streaming down his face as he touched their daughter's tiny hand. "We have a daughter." Clara studied the baby's features. Caleb's gray eyes, her own dark hair, a perfect blend of both of them, and something entirely new. "She's beautiful. She's perfect." Caleb pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead, then one to the baby's. "What should we name her?" Clara had been thinking about this for months, turning names over in her mind, searching for one that felt right. Now, looking at her daughter for the first time, the answer came to her clearly. "Rose," she said, "for the garden that brought us together, for Sarah's roses that survived the neglect and bloomed again, for all the beautiful things that grow from difficult soil." Caleb's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Rose, it's perfect." Rose Hartman thrived from her first breath, growing strong and healthy as the seasons turned. She had her father's quiet intensity and her mother's stubborn determination, and she was adored by everyone on the ranch. The hands competed for the privilege of holding her, of making her laugh, of watching her discover the world with wide gray eyes. Clara watched her daughter grow and felt the last broken pieces of her old self finally fall away. She wasn't the scared, diminished woman Thomas had created anymore. She wasn't the desperate widow who'd walked into a frontier plaza with nothing but 3 kitchen items and a refusal to give up. She was Clara Hartman, wife and mother, a woman who had built a beautiful life from the ashes of a terrible one. One evening, when Rose was nearly a year old, Clara found herself in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals glowing in the golden light, and the tulips Sarah had planted so many years ago were pushing up through the soil, ready for another spring. Caleb found her there, their daughter in his arms, his face soft with the contentment of a man who had finally found peace. "What are you thinking?" he asked, settling beside her on the old wooden bench. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I'm thinking about the road that brought me here, all the pain and loss and despair, all the moments when I wanted to give up but kept going anyway." "Do you regret any of it?" "No." The word came without hesitation. "Every step, every stumble, every moment of darkness, it all led me here. To you. To Rose, to this life I never dared to dream about." She reached for his free hand and laced her fingers through his. "I wouldn't change anything, Caleb. Not one single thing." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Neither would I." Rose made a happy sound, reaching for one of the roses blooming nearby. Caleb shifted her in his arms so she could touch the soft petals, her tiny fingers exploring the flower with wonder. "She's going to grow up here," Clara said softly. "She's going to know this garden, this ranch, this life. She's going to be surrounded by people who love her. And she's going to know her mother's story," Caleb added. "The story of a woman who lost everything and refused to be destroyed. The story of a woman who walked through fire and found something beautiful on the other side." Clara smiled, leaning into him, feeling the warmth of her husband and daughter against her. "That's not just my story, it's ours. We both walked through fire. We both found each other on the other side." "Then that's the story we'll tell her." Caleb pressed a kiss to Clara's temple. "The story of 2 broken people who helped each other heal. The story of a ranch that came back to life. The story of a family built on second chances and stubborn hope." The stars were appearing now, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds on velvet. Clara watched them emerge one by one, remembering all the nights she'd spent looking up at those same stars, wondering if she would survive long enough to see another dawn. She had survived. More than survived. She had flourished. She had found love and purpose and a home she'd never expected. She had become someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of joy she'd thought was lost to her forever. "I love you," she said to Caleb, the words still feeling like a miracle every time she spoke them. "I love you too." He gathered her closer, their daughter nestled between them. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that, for the rest of our lives." Clara closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. The peace, the gratitude, the overwhelming rightness of this moment and this place and these people she loved. She thought about her mother's wooden spoon, still in the kitchen where it belonged, still being used to stir the meals that nourished her family. She thought about the cracked pot that had somehow held together through everything, now retired to a place of honor on the mantel. She thought about the worn skillet that had cooked 1,000 meals, seasoned with decades of use and love. Those 3 worthless kitchen items had saved her life, or rather, they had given her the tools to save herself. And now, sitting in a garden full of roses with her husband beside her and her daughter in her arms, Clara finally understood what her mother had tried to teach her all those years ago. Food was dignity, cooking was love, and a woman who could feed others would never be truly worthless, no matter what the world tried to tell her. Clara had fed this ranch back to life. She had fed Caleb back to himself, and now she would feed her daughter, would nourish her with good food and unconditional love, and the unshakable knowledge that she was worthy of every beautiful thing the world had to offer. The night settled over the valley, soft and peaceful. The ranch quieted around them, the men in the bunkhouse, the cattle in the fields, the horses drowsing in the new barn that had risen from the ashes of the old one. Rose fell asleep in her father's arms, her tiny fist still clutching a fallen rose petal. Caleb and Clara sat together in the garden they had restored, watching the moon rise over the mountains, content in the silence that had once felt empty and now felt full. They had built something beautiful here, something strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to survive any drought, real enough to last forever. From nothing, everything. From ashes, roses. From broken hearts, a love that healed. Clara smiled into the darkness and let herself believe, finally and completely, in the life she had earned. Not given, not stumbled into. Earned with every step of that long walk through the wilderness, with every meal cooked and every hand extended, with every act of stubborn courage that had brought her here. She was Clara Hartman, wife, mother, cook, gardener, builder of homes and healer of hearts. She had walked into this valley with nothing, and she had found everything, and she would spend the rest of her life grateful for every single moment of the journey.